Chapter 10 of Anna of the Five Towns. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Anna Roberts. Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 10. The Isle. About this time Anna was not seeing very much of Henry Myners. At 20 a man is rash in love, and again perhaps at 50, a man of middle age enamoured of a young girl is capable of sublime follies. But the man of 30, who loves for the first time, is usually the embodiment of cautious discretion. He does not fall in love with a violent descent, but rather lets himself gently down, continually testing the rope. His social value, especially if he have achieved worldly success, is at its highest, and, without conceit, he is aware of it. He has lost many illusions concerning women. He has seen more than one friend wrecked in the sea of foolish marriage. He knows the joys of a bachelor's freedom, without having wearied of them. He perceives risks where the youth perceives only ecstasy, and the oldster only a blissful release from solitude. Instead of searching, he is sought for. Accordingly, he is selfish and exacting. All these things combine to tranquilize passion at 30. Myners was in love with Anna, and his love had its ardent moments, but in the main it was a temperate affection, an affection that walked circumspectly, with its eyes open, careful of its dignity, too proud to seem in a hurry. If by impulse it chanced now and then to leap forward, the involuntary movement was mastered and checked. Myners called at Manor Terrace once a week, never on the same day of the week, nor without discussing business with the miser. Occasionally he accompanied Anna from school or chapel. Such methods were precisely to Anna's taste. Like him, she loved prudence and decorum, preferring to make haste slowly. Since the revival, they had only once talked together intimately. On that sole occasion Henry had suggested to her that she might care to join Mrs. Sutton's class, which met on Monday nights. She accepted the hint with pleasure, and found a well of spiritual inspiration in Mrs. Sutton's modest and simple, yet fervent homilies. Myners was not guilty of blowing both hot and cold. She was sure of him. She waited calmly for events, existing, as her habit was, in the future. The future, then, meant the Isle of Man. Anna dreamed of an enchanted isle and hours of unimaginable rapture. For a whole week after Mrs. Sutton had won Ephraim's consent, her vision never stooped to practical details. Then Beatrice called to see her. It was the morning after the treat, and Anna was brushing her muddy frock. She wore a large white apron, and held a cloth brush in her hand as she opened the door. "You're busy?" said Beatrice. "Yes," said Anna, "but come in. Come into the kitchen, do you mind?" Beatrice was covered from neck to heel with a long mackintosh, which she threw off when entering the kitchen. "Anyone else in the house?" she asked. "No," said Anna, smiling, as Beatrice seated herself with a sigh of content on the table. "Well, let's talk then." Beatrice drew from her pocket the indispensable chocolates and offered them to Anna. "I say, wasn't last night perfectly awful? Henry got wet through in the end, and Mother made him stop at our house, as he was at the trouble to take me home. Did you see him go down this morning?" "No, why?" said Anna, stiffly. "Oh, no reason, only I thought perhaps you did. I simply can't tell you how glad I am that you're coming with us to the Isle of Man. We shall have rare fun. We go every year, you know, to Port Erin, a lovely little fishing village. All the fishermen know us there. Last year Henry hired a yacht for the fortnight, and we all went mackerel fishing, every day, except sometimes Pa. Now and then Pa had a tendency to go fiddling in caves and things. I do hope it will be fine weather again by then, don't you?" "I'm looking forward to it, I can tell you," Anna said. "What day are we supposed to start?" "Saturday week." "So soon?" Anna was surprised at the proximity of the event. "Yes, and quite late enough, too. We should start earlier, only the Dad always makes out he can't. Men always pretend to be so frightfully busy, and I believe it's all put on." Beatrice continued to chat about the holiday, and then of a sudden she asked, "What are you going to wear?" "Wear?" Anna repeated, and added with hesitation, "I suppose one will want some new clothes?" "Well, just a few. Now let me advise you. Take a blue serge skirt. Sea-water won't harm it, and if it's dark enough, it will look well to any mortal blouse. Secondly, you can't have too many blouses. They're always useful at the seaside. Plain straw hats are my tip. A coat for nights, and thick boots. There, of course no one ever dresses at Port Erin. It isn't like the Llandudno, and all that sort of thing. You don't have to meet your young man on the pier, because there isn't a pier." There was a pause. Anna did not know what to say. At length she ventured, "I'm not much for clothes, as I dare say you've noticed." "I think you always look nice, my dear," Beatrice responded. Nothing was said as to Anna's wealth, no reference made as to the discrepancy between that and the style of her garments. By a fiction, there was supposed to be no discrepancy. "Do you make your own frocks?" Beatrice asked later. "Yes." "Do you know, I thought you did, but they do you great credit. There's few people can make a plain frock look decent." This conversation brought Anna with a shock to the level of earth. She perceived, only too well, a point which she had not hitherto fairly faced in her idyllic meditations, that her father was still a factor in the case. Since Mrs. Sutton's visit both Anna and the miser avoided the subject of the holiday. You can't have too many blouses. Did Beatrice, then, have blouses by the dozen? A coat, a serge skirt, straw hats, how many? The catalogue frightened her. She began to suspect that she would not be able to go to the Isle of Man. "About me going with the Suttons to the Isle of Man?" she accosted her father in the afternoon, outwardly calm, but with secret trembling. "Well?" he exclaimed savagely. "I shall want some money, a little." She would have given much not to have added that little, but it came out of itself. "It's a waste o' time and money, that's what I call it. I can't think why Suttons ask ye. Ye aren't ill, are ye?" His savagery changed to sullenness. "No, father, but as it's arranged, I suppose I shall have to go." "Well, I'm none so set up with the idea mysen." "Shan't you be all right with Agnes?" "Oh, yes, I shall be all right. I don't want much. I've no fads and fal lals. How long art going to be away?" "I don't know. Didn't Mrs. Sutton tell you? You arranged it." "That I didna. Her said not to me." "Well, anyhow I shall want some clothes." "What for? Art naked?" "I must have some money." Her voice shook. She was getting near tears. "Well, thou's gotten thy own money, hasna?" "All I want is that you shall let me have some of my own money. There's 40-odd pounds now in the bank." "Oh," he repeated, sneering, "all you want is as I shall let thee have some of thy own money. And there's 40-odd pound in the bank, oh!" "Will you give me my cheque-book out of the bureau? And I'll draw a cheque, I know how to." She had conquered the instinct to cry, and unwillingly her tones became somewhat peremptory. Ephraim seized the chance. "No, I won't give ye the cheque-book out of the bureau," he said flatly, "and I'll thank ye for less sauce." That finished the episode. Proudly she took an oath with herself not to reopen the question, and resolved to write a note to Mrs. Sutton, saying that on consideration she found it impossible to go to the Isle of Man. The next morning there came to Anna a letter from the secretary of a limited company, enclosing a post-office order for £10. Some weeks previously her father had discovered an error of that amount in the deduction of income tax from the dividend paid by this company, and had instructed Anna to demand the sum. She had obeyed, and then forgotten the affair. Here was the answer. Desperate at the thought of missing the holiday, she cashed the order, bought and made her clothes in secret, and then, 2 days before the arranged date of departure, told her father what she had done. He was enraged, but since his anger was too illogical to be rendered effectively coherent in words, he had the wit to keep silence. With bitterness Anna reflected that she owed her holiday to the merest accident, for if the remittance had arrived a little earlier, or a little later, or in the form of a cheque, she could not have utilized it. It was an incredible day the following Saturday, a warm and benign day of earliest autumn. The Suttons, in a hired cab, called for Anna at 8:30, on the way to the main line station at Shawport. Anna's tin box was flung onto the roof of the cab, amid the trunks and portmanteaux already there. "Why should not Agnes ride with us to the station?" Beatrice suggested. "Nay, nay, there's no room," said Tellwright, who stood at the door, impelled by an unacknowledged awe of Mrs. Sutton thus to give official sanction to Anna's departure. "Yes, yes," Mrs. Sutton exclaimed, "let the little thing come, Mr. Tellwright." Agnes, far more excited than any of the rest, seized her straw hat, and slipping the elastic under her small chin, sprang into the cab, and found a haven between Mr. Sutton's short fat legs. The driver drew his whip smartly across the aged neck of the cream mare. They were off. What a rumbling, jolting, delicious journey, down the first hill, up Duck Bank, through the market-place, and down the steep declivity of Oldcastle Street! Silent and shy, Agnes smiled ecstatically at the others. Anna answered remarks in a dream. She was conscious only of present happiness and happy expectation. All bitterness had disappeared. At least 30,000 Bursley folk were not going to the Isle of Man that day. Their preoccupied and cheerless faces swam in a continuous stream past the cab window, and Anna sympathized with every unit of them. Her spirit overflowed with universal compassion. What haste and exquisite confusion at the station! The train was signaled, and the porter, crossing the line with the luggage, ran his truck perilously under the very buffers of the incoming engine. Miners was awaiting them, admirably attired as a tourist. He had got the tickets, and secured a private compartment in the through coach for Liverpool, and he found time to arrange with the cabman to drive Agnes home on the box seat. Certainly there was none like Miners. From the footboard of the carriage Anna bent down to kiss Agnes. The child had been laughing and chattering. Suddenly, as Anna's lips touched hers, she burst into tears, sobbed passionately as though overtaken by some terrible and unexpected misfortune. Tears also stood in Anna's eyes. The sisters had never been parted before. "Poor little thing," Mrs. Sutton murmured, and Beatrice told her father to give Agnes a shilling to buy chocolates at Stevenson's in St. Luke's Square, that being the best shop. The shilling fell between the footboard and the platform. A scream from Beatrice. The attendant porter promised to rescue the shilling in due course. The engine whistled, the silver-mounted guard asserted his authority, Miners leapt in, and amid laughter and tears the brief and unique joy of Anna's life began. In a moment, so it seemed, the train was thundering through the mile of solid rock which ends at Lime Street Station, Liverpool. Thenceforward, till she fell asleep that night, Anna existed in a state of blissful bewilderment, stupefied by an overdose of novel and wondrous sensations. They lunched in amazing magnificence at the Bear's Paw, and then walked through the crowded and prodigious streets to Prince's Landing Stage. The luggage had disappeared by some mysterious agency. Miners said that they would find it safe at Douglas, but Anna could not banish the fear that her tin box had gone forever. The great wavy river, churned by thousands of keels, the monstrous steamer, the Mona's Isle, whose side rose like solid wall out of the water, the vistas of its decks, its vast saloons, story under story, solid and palatial, could all this float? Its high bridge, its hawsers as thick as trees, its funnels like sloping towers, the multitudes of passengers, the whistles, hoots, cries, the far-stretching panorama of wharves and docks, the squat ferry craft carrying horses and carts, and no one looking twice at the feet. It was all too much, too astonishing, too lovely. She had not guessed at this. "They call Liverpool the slum of Europe," said Miners. "How can you?" she exclaimed, shocked. Beatrice, seeing her radiant and rapt face, walked to and fro with Anna, proud of the effect produced on her friend's inexperience by these sights. One might have thought that Beatrice had built Liverpool, and created its trade by her own efforts. Suddenly the landing stage and all the people on it moved away bodily from the ship. There was green water between. A tremor like that of an earthquake ran along the deck. Handkerchiefs were waved. The voyage had commenced. Miners found chairs for all the Suttons, and tucked them up on the lee side of a deck-house, but Anna did not stir. They passed New Brighton, Seaforth, and the Crosby and Formby lightships. "Come and view the ship," said Miners at her side. "Suppose we go round and inspect things a bit." "It's a very big one, isn't it?" she asked. "Pretty big," he said. "Of course, not as big as the Atlantic liners. I wonder we didn't meet one in the river, but still pretty big. 320 feet over all. I sailed on her last year on her maiden voyage. She was packed, and the weather was very bad." "Will it be rough today?" Anna inquired timidly. "Not if it keeps like this," he laughed. "You don't feel queer, do you?" "Oh, no, it's as firm as a house. No one could be ill with this." "Couldn't they?" he exclaimed. "Beatrice could be." They descended into the ship, and he explained all its internal economy with a knowledge that seemed to her encyclopedic. They stayed a long time watching the engines, so titanic, ruthless, and deliberate. Even the smell of the oil was pleasant to Anna. When they came on deck again the ship was at sea. For the first time Anna beheld the ocean. A strong breeze blew from prow to stern, yet the sea was absolutely calm, the unruffled mirror of effulgent sunlight. The steamer moved alone on the waters, exultantly, leaving behind it an endless track of white froth in the green, and the shadow of its smoke. The sun, the salt breeze, the living water, the proud gaiety of the ship, produced a feeling of intense, inexplicable joy, a profound satisfaction with the present, and a negligence of past and future. To exist was enough then. As Anna and Henry leaned over the starboard quarter and watched the torrent of foam rush madly and ceaselessly from under the paddle-box to be swallowed up in the white wake, the spectacle of the wild torrent almost hypnotized them, destroying thought and reason, and all sense of their relation to other things. With difficulty Anna raised her eyes, and perceived the dim receding line of the Lancashire coast. "Shall we get quite out of sight of land?" she asked. "Yes, for a little while, about half an hour or so. Just as much out of sight of land as if we were in the middle of the Atlantic." "I can scarcely believe it." "Believe what?" "Oh, the idea of that, of being out of sight of land, nothing but sea." When at last it occurred to them to reconnoitre the Suttons, they found all three still in their deck chairs, enwrapped and languid. Mr. Sutton and Beatrice were apparently dozing. This part of the deck was occupied by somnolent, basking figures. "Don't wake them," Mrs. Sutton enjoined, whispering out of her hood. Anna glanced curiously at Beatrice's yellow face. "Go away, do," Beatrice exclaimed, opening her eyes and shutting them again, wearily. So they went away, and discovered 2 empty deck chairs on the foredeck. Anna was innocently vain of her immunity from malaise. Miners appeared to appoint himself little errands about the deck, returning frequently to his chair. "Look over there, can you see anything?" Anna ran to the rail, with the infantile idea of getting nearer, and Miners followed, laughing. What looked like a small, slate-colored cloud lay on the horizon. "I seem to see something," she said. "That is the Isle of Man." By insensible gradations the contours of the land grew clearer in the afternoon haze. "How far are we off now?" "Perhaps 20 miles." 20 miles of uninterrupted flatness, and the ship steadily invading that separating solitude, yard by yard, furlong by furlong. The conception awed her. There, a morsel in the waste of the deep, a speck under the infinite sunlight, lay the island, mysterious, enticing, enchanted, a glinting jewel on the sea's bosom, a remote entity fraught with strange secrets. It was all unspeakable. "Anna, you have covered yourself with glory," said Mrs. Sutton, when they were in the diminutive and absurd train which by breathless plunges annihilates the 16 miles between Douglas and Port Erin in 65 minutes. "Have I?" she answered. "How?" "By not being ill." "That's always the beginner's luck," said Beatrice, pale and dishevelled. They all relapsed into the silence of fatigue. It was growing dusk when the train stopped at the tiny terminus. The station was a hive of bustling activity, the arrival of this train being the daily event at that end of the world. Miners and the Suttons were greeted familiarly by several sailors, and one of these, Tom Kelly, a tall, middle-aged man, with gray beard, small gray eyes, a wrinkled skin of red mahogany, and an enormous fist, was introduced to Anna. He raised his cap and shook hands. She was touched by the sad, kind look on his face, the melancholy impress of the sea. Then they drove to their lodging, and here again the party was welcomed as being old and tried friends. A fire was burning in the parlor. Throwing herself down in front of it, Mrs. Sutton breathed, "At last! Oh, for some tea!" Through the window Anna had a glimpse of a deeply indented bay at the foot of the cliffs below them, with a bold headland to the right. Fishing vessels with flat red sails seemed to hang undecided just outside the bay. From cottage chimneys beneath the road blue smoke softly ascended. All went early to bed, for the weariness of Mr. and Mrs. Sutton seemed to communicate itself to the 3 young people, who might otherwise have gone forth into the village in search of adventures. Anna and Beatrice shared a room. Each inspected the other's clothes, and Beatrice made Anna try on the new serge skirt. Through the thin wall came the sound of Mr. and Mrs. Sutton talking, a high voice, then a bass reply, in continual alternation. Beatrice said that those 2 always discussed the day's doing in such a manner. In a few moments Beatrice was snoring. She had the subdued but steady and serious snore characteristic of some muscular men. Anna felt no inclination to sleep. She lived again hour by hour through the day, and beneath Beatrice's snore her ear caught the undertone of the sea. The next morning was as lovely as the last. It was Sunday, and every activity of the village was stilled. Sea and land were equally folded in a sunlit calm. During breakfast, a meal abundant in fresh herrings, fresh eggs, and fresh rolls, eaten with the windows wide open, Anna was puzzled by the singular amenity of her friends to one another and to her. They were as polite as though they had been strangers, they chatted amiably, were full of good-will, and as anxious to give happiness as to enjoy it. She thought at first, so unusual was it to her as a feature of domestic privacy, that this demeanour was affected, or at any rate a somewhat exaggerated punctilio due to her presence, but she soon came to see that she was mistaken. After breakfast Mr. Sutton suggested that they should attend the Wesleyan chapel on the hill leading to the chasms. Here they met the sailors of the night before, arrayed now in marvelous blue Melton coats with velveteen collars. Tom Kelly walked back with them to the beach, and showed them the yacht Fay which the miners had arranged to hire for mackerel fishing. It lay on the sands, speckless, in new white paint. All the afternoon they dozed on the cliffs, doing nothing whatever, for this Sunday was tacitly regarded not as part of the holiday, but as a preparation for the holiday. All felt that the holiday, with its proper exertions and appointed delights, would really begin on Monday morning. "Let us go for a walk," said Miners, after tea, to Beatrice and Anna. They stood at the gate of the lodging-house. The old people were resting within. "You 2 go," Beatrice replied, looking at Anna. "You know I hate walking, Henry. I'll stop with Mother and Dad." Throughout the day Anna had been conscious of the fact that all the Suttons showed a tendency, slight but perceptible, to treat Henry and herself as a pair desirous of opportunities for being alone together. She did not like it. She flushed under the passing glance with which Beatrice accompanied the words, "You two go." Nevertheless, when Myners placidly remarked, "Very well," and his eyes sought hers for a consent, she could not refuse it. One part of her nature would have preferred to find an excuse for staying at home, but another, and a stronger, part insisted on seizing this offered joy. They walked straight up out of the village toward the high coast range which stretches peak after peak from Port Erin to Peel. The stony and devious lanes wound about the bleak hillside, passing here and there small solitary cottages of whitewashed stone, with children, fowls, and dogs at the doors, all embowered in huge fuchsia trees. Presently they had surmounted the limit of habitation, and were on the naked flank of Brada, following a narrow track which crept upwards amid short mossy turf of the most vivid green. Nothing seemed to flourish on this exposed height, except bracken, sheep, and boulders that from a distance resembled sheep. There was no tree, scarcely a shrub. The immense contours, stark, grim, and unrelieved, rose in melancholy and defiant majesty against the sky. The hand of man could coax no harvest from these smooth but obdurate slopes. They had never relented, and they would never relent. The spirit was braced by the thought that here, to the furthest eternity of civilization, more and more intricate, simple and strong souls would always find solace and repose. Myners bore to the left for a while, striking across the moor in the direction of the sea. Then he said, "Look down now." The little bay lay like an oblong swimming bath 500 feet below them. The surface of the water was like glass. The strand, with its phalanx of boats drawn up in Sabbath tidiness, glittered like marble in the living light, and over this marble black dots moved slowly to and fro. Behind the boats were the houses, dolls' houses, each with a curling wisp of smoke. Further away the railing and the high road ran out in a black and white line to Port St. Mary's. The sea, a pale grey, encompassed all. The southern sky had a faint sapphire tinge, rising to delicate azure. The sight of this haven at rest, shut in by the restful sea, and by great moveless hills, a calm within a calm, aroused profound emotion. "It's lovely," said Anna, as they stood gazing. Tears came to her eyes and hung there. She wondered that scenery should cause tears, felt ashamed, and turned her face so that Myners should not see. But he had seen. "Shall we go on to the top?" he suggested, and they set their faces northward to climb still higher. At length they stood on the rocky summit of Brada, 700 feet from the sea. The hill of the night watch lifted above them to the north, but on east, south, and west the prospect was bounded only by the ocean. The coastline was revealed for 30 miles, from Peel to Castletown. Far to the east was Castletown Bay, large, shallow, and inhospitable, its floor strewn with 1,000 unseen wrecks. The lighthouse at Scarlet Point flashed dimly in the dusk. Thence the beach curved nearer in an immense arc, without a sign of life, to the little cove of Port St. Mary, and jutted out again into a tongue of land at the end of which lay the Calf of Man, with its single white cottage and cart-track. The dangerous Calf Sound, where the vexed tide is forced to run 9 hours one way and 3 the other, seemed like a grey ribbon, and the Chicken Rock like a tiny pencil on a vast slate. Port Erin was hidden under their feet. They looked westward. The darkening sky was a labyrinth of purple and crimson scarves drawn pellucid, as though by the finger of God, across a sheet of pure saffron. These decadent tints of the sunset faded in every direction to the same soft azure which filled the south, and one star twinkled in the illimitable field. 30 miles off on the horizon could be discerned the Mourne Mountains of Ireland. "See!" Myners exclaimed, touching her arm. The huge disk of the moon was rising in the east, and as this mild lamp passed up the sky, the sense of universal quiescence increased. Lovely, Anna had said. It was the loveliest sight her eyes had ever beheld, a panorama of pure beauty transcending all imagined visions. It overwhelmed her, thrilled her to the heart, this revelation of the loveliness of the world. Her thoughts went back to Hambridge and Bursley and her life there, and all the remembered scenes, bathed in the glow of a new ideal, seemed to lose their pain. It was as if she had never been really unhappy, as if there was no real unhappiness on the whole earth. She perceived that the monotony, the austerity, the melancholy of her existence had been sweet and beautiful of its kind, and she recalled with a sort of rapture hours of companionship with the beloved Agnes, when her father was equable and pacific. Nothing was ugly nor mean. Beauty was everywhere, in everything. In silence they began to descend, perforce walking quickly because of the steep gradient. At the first cottage they saw a little girl in a mob cap playing with 2 kittens. "How like Agnes," Miners said. "Yes, I was just thinking so," Anna answered. "I thought of her up on the hill," he continued. "She will miss you, won't she? I know she cried herself to sleep last night. You mightn't guess it, but she is extremely sensitive." "Not guess it? Why not? I am sure she is. Do you know, I am very fond of your sister. She's a simply delightful child. And there's a lot in her, too. She's so quick and bright, and somehow like a little woman." "She's exactly like a woman sometimes," Anna agreed. "Sometimes I fancy she's a great deal older than I am." "Older than any of us," he corrected. "I'm glad you like her," Anna said, content. "She thinks all the world of you." And she added, "My word, wouldn't she be vexed if she knew I had told you that?" This appreciation of Agnes brought them into closer intimacy, and they talked the more easily of other things. "It will freeze tonight," Miners said. And then, suddenly looking at her in the twilight, "You are feeling chill." "Oh, no," she protested. "But you are. Put this muffler round your neck." He took a muffler from his pocket. "Oh, no, really, you will need it yourself." She drew a little away from him, as if to avoid the muffler. "Please take it." She did so and thanked him, tying it loosely and untidily round her throat. That feeling of the untidiness of the muffler, of its being something strange to her skin, something with the rough virtue of masculinity, which no one could detect in the gloom, was in itself pleasant. "I wager Mrs. Sutton has a good fire burning when we get in," he said. She thought with joyous anticipation of the warm, bright sitting-room, the supper, and the vivacious good-natured conversation. Though the walk was nearly at an end, other delights were in store. Of the holiday, 13 complete days yet remained, each to be as happy as the one now closing. It was an age. At last they entered the human coziness of the village. As they walked up the steps of their lodging, and he opened the door for her, she quickly drew off the muffler and returned it to him with a word of thanks. On Monday morning, when Beatrice and Anna came downstairs, they found the breakfast odorously cooling on the table, and nobody in the room. "Where are they all, I wonder? Any letters?" Beatrice said. "There's your mother out on the front, and Mr. Miners too." Beatrice threw up the window and called, "Come along, Henry, come along, mother, everything's getting cold." "Is it?" Miners cheerfully replied. "Come out here, both of you, and begin the day properly with a dose of ozone." "I loathe cold bacon," said Beatrice, glancing at the table, and they went out into the road, where Mrs. Sutton kissed them with as much fervor as if they had arrived from a long journey. "You look pale, Anna," she remarked. "Do I?" said Anna. "I don't feel pale." "It's that long walk last night," Beatrice put in. "Henry always goes too far." "I don't," Anna began, but at that moment Mr. Sutton, lumbering and ponderous, joined the party. "Henry," he said, without greeting anyone, "hast noticed those half-finished houses down the road yonder by the Falcon? I've been having a chat with Kelly, and he tells me the fellow that was building them has gone bankrupt, and they're at a standstill. The receiver wants to sell 'em. In fact, Kelly says they're going cheap. I believe they'd be a good spec." "Eh, dear," Mrs. Sutton interrupted him. "Father, I wish you would leave your specs alone when you're on holiday." "Now, missus," he affectionately protested, and continued, "they're fairly well built, seemingly, and the rafters are on the roof. Anna," he turned to her quickly, as if counting on her sympathy, "you must come with me, and look at 'em after breakfast. Happen they might suit your father, or you. I know your father's fond of a good spec." She assented with a ready smile. This was the beginning of a fancy which the alderman always afterward showed for Anna. After breakfast, Mrs. Sutton, Beatrice, and Anna arranged to go shopping. "Father, brass," Mrs. Sutton ejaculated in 2 monosyllables to her husband. "How much will content ye?" he asked mildly. "Give me 5 or 10 pounds to go on with." He opened the left-hand front pocket of his trousers, a pocket which fastened with a button, and leaning back in his chair drew out a fat purse, and passed it to his wife with a preoccupied air. She helped herself, and then Beatrice intercepted the purse and lightened it of half a sovereign. "Pocket money," Beatrice said. "I'm ruined." The alderman's eyes requested Anna to observe how he was robbed. At last the purse was safely buttoned up again. Mrs. Sutton's purchases of food at the 3 principal shops of the village seemed startling profuse to Anna, but gradually she became accustomed to the scale, and to the amazing habit of always buying the very best of everything from beefsteak to grapes. Anna calculated that the housekeeping could not cost less than £6 a week for the 5. At Manor Terrace 3 people existed on £1. With her half-sovereign, Beatrice bought a belt and a pair of sand shoes, and some cigarettes for Henry. Mrs. Sutton bought a pipe with a nickel cap, such as is used by sailors. When they returned to the house, Mr. Sutton and Henry were smoking on the front. All 5 walked in a row down to the harbour, the alderman giving an arm each to Beatrice and Anna. Near the Falcon, the procession had to be stopped in order to view the unfinished houses. Tom Kelly had a cabin partly excavated out of the rock behind the little quay. Here they found him entangled amid nets, sails, and oars. All crowded into the cabin and shook hands with its owner, who remarked with severity on their pallid faces, and insisted that a change of complexion must be brought about. Miners offered him his tobacco pouch, but on seeing the light color of the tobacco he shook his head and refused it, at the same time taking from within his jersey a lump of something that resembled leather. "Give him this, Henry," Mrs. Sutton whispered, handing Miners the pipe which she had bought. "Mrs. Sutton wishes you to accept this," said Miners. "Eh, thank ye," he exclaimed. "There's a leddy that knows my taste." He cut some shreds from his plug with a clasp knife, and charged and lighted the pipe, filling the cabin with asphyxiating fumes. "I don't know how you can smoke such horrid, nasty stuff," said Beatrice, coughing. He laughed condescendingly at Beatrice's petulant manner. "That stuff of Henry's is boys' tobacco," he said shortly. It was decided that they should go fishing in the Fay. There was a light southerly breeze, a cloudy sky, and smooth water. Under charge of young Tom Kelly, a sheepish lad of 16, with his father's smile, they all got into a conceivably small dinghy, loading it down till it was almost awash. Old Tom himself helped Anna to embark, told her where to tread, and forced her gently into a seat at the stern. No one else seemed to be disturbed, but Anna was in a state of desperate fear. She had never committed herself to a boat before, and the little waves spat up against the sides in a most alarming way, as young Tom jerked the dinghy along with the short sculls. She went white, and clung in silence fiercely to the gunwale. In a few moments they were tied up to the Fay, which seemed very big and safe in comparison with the dinghy. They clambered on board, and in the deep well of the 2-ton yacht Anna contrived to collect her wits. She was reassured by the painted legend in the well, "Licensed to carry 11." Young Tom and Henry busied themselves with ropes, and suddenly a huge white sail began to ascend the mast. It flapped like thunder in the gentle breeze. Tom pulled up the anchor, curling the chain round and round on the forward deck, and then Anna noticed that, although the wind was scarcely perceptible, they were gliding quickly past the embankment. Henry was at the tiller. The next minute Tom had set the jib, and by this time the Fay was approaching the breakwater at a great pace. There was no rolling or pitching, but simply a smooth, swift progression over the calm surface. Anna thought it the ideal of locomotion. As soon as they were beyond the breakwater and the sails caught the breeze from the sound, the Fay lay over as if shot, and a little column of green water flung itself on the lee combing of the well. Anna screamed as she saw the water and felt the angle of the floor suddenly change, but when everyone laughed, she laughed too. Henry, noticing the whiteness of her knuckles as she gripped the combing, explained the disconcerting phenomena. Anna tried to be at ease, but she was not. She could not for a long time dismiss the suspicion that all these people were foolishly blind to a peril which she alone had the sagacity to perceive. They cruised about while Tom prepared the lines. The short waves chopped cheerfully against the carvel sides of the yacht. The clouds were breaking at 100 points. The sea grew lighter in tone. Gaiety was in the air. No one could possibly be indisposed in that innocuous weather. At length the lines were ready, but Tom said the yacht was making at least a knot too much for serious fishing, so Henry took a reef in the mainsail, showing Anna how to tie the abort strings. The alderman, lying on the foredeck, was placidly smoking. The lines were thrown out astern, and Mrs. Sutton and Beatrice each took one. But they had no success. Young Tom said it was because the sun had appeared. "Caught anything?" Mr. Sutton inquired at intervals. After a time he said, "Suppose Anna and I have a try." It was agreed. "What must I do?" asked Anna, brave now. "You just hold the line, so, and if you feel a little jerk, that's a mackerel." These were the instructions of Beatrice. Anna was becoming excited. She had not held the line 10 seconds before she cried out, "I've got one!" "Nonsense," said Beatrice. "Everyone thinks at first that the motion of the waves against the line is a fish." "Well," said Henry, giving the tiller to young Tom, "let's haul in and see anyway." Before doing so he held the line for a moment, testing it, and winked at Anna. While Anna and Henry were hauling in, the alderman, dropping his pipe, began also to haul in his own line with great fury. "Got one, father?" Mrs. Sutton asked. "Aye." Both lines came in together, and on each was a pounder. Anna saw her fish gleam and flash like silver in the clear water as it neared the surface. Henry held the short line, letting the mackerel plunge and jerk, and then seized and unhooked the catch. "How cruel!" Anna cried, startled at the nearness of the two fish as they sprang about in an old sugar-box at her feet. Young Tom laughed loud at her exclamation. "They can't feel, miss," he sniggered. Anna wondered that a mouth so soft and kind could utter such heartless words. In an hour the united efforts of the party had caught 9 mackerel. It was not a multitude, but the sun, in perfecting the weather, had spoilt the sport. Anna had ceased to commiserate the captured fish. She was obliged, however, to avert her head when Tom cut some skin from the side of one of the mackerel, to provide fresh bait. This device seemed to her the extremest refinement of cruelty. Beatrice grew ominously silent and inert, and Mrs. Sutton glanced first at her daughter, and then at her husband. The latter nodded. "We'd better be getting back, Henry," said the alderman. The Fay swept home like a bird. They were at the quay, and Kelly was dragging them one by one from the black dinghy onto what the alderman called terra firma. Henry had the fish on a string. "How many did you catch, Miss Tellwright?" Kelly asked benevolently. "I caught 4, Anna replied. Never before had she felt so proud, elated, and boisterous. Never had the blood so wildly danced in her veins. She looked at her short blue skirt, which showed 3 inches of ankle, put forward her brown-shod foot like a vain coquette, and darted a covert look at Henry. When he caught it, she laughed instead of blushing. "You're doin' well," Tom Kelly approved. "You'll make a fine mackerel fisher." 5 of the mackerel were given to young Tom. The other 4 preceded a fowl in the menu of dinner. They were called Anna's mackerel, and all the diners agreed that better mackerel had never been lured out of the Irish Sea. In the afternoon the alderman and his wife slept as usual, Mr. Sutton with a bandana handkerchief over his face. The rest went out immediately. The invitation of the sun and the sea was far too persuasive to be resisted. "I'm going to paint," said Beatrice, with a resolute mien. "I want to paint broad ahead frightfully. I tried last year, but it got too dark somehow. I've improved since then. What are you going to do?" "We'll come and watch you," said Henry. "Oh, no, you won't. At least, you won't. You're such a critic. Anna can come if she likes." "What? And me be left all afternoon by myself?" "Well, suppose you go with him, Anna, just to keep him from being bored." Anna hesitated. Once more she had the uncomfortable suspicion that Miners and herself were being maneuvered. "Look here," said Miners to Beatrice. "Have you decided absolutely to paint?" "Absolutely." The finality of the answer seemed to have a touch of resentment. "Then," he turned to Anna, "let's go and get that dinghy and row about the bay, eh?" She could offer no rational objection, and they were soon putting off from the jetty, impelled seaward by a mighty push from Kelly's arm. It was very hot. Miners wore white flannels. He removed his coat, and turned up his sleeves, showing thick, hairy arms. He sculled in a manner almost dramatic, and the dinghy shot about like a water-spider on a brook. Anna had nothing to do except to sit still and enjoy. Everything was drowned in dazzling sunlight, and both Henry and Anna could feel the process of tanning on their faces. The bay shimmered with a million diamond points. It was impossible to keep the eyes open without frowning, and soon Anna could see the beads of sweat on Henry's crimson brow. "Warm?" she said. This was the first word of conversation. He merely smiled in reply. Presently they were at the other side of the bay, in a cave whose sandy and rock-strewn floor trembled clear under a fathom of blue water. They landed on a jutting rock. Henry pushed his straw hat back and wiped his forehead. "Glorious! Glorious!" he exclaimed. "Do you swim? No? You should get Beatrice to teach you. I swam out here this morning at 7 o'clock. It was chilly enough then. Oh, I forgot I told you at breakfast." She could see him in the translucent water, swimming with long, powerful strokes. Dozens of boats were moving lazily in the bay, each with a cargo of parasols. "There's a good deal of the sunshade afloat," he remarked. "Why haven't you got one? You'll get as brown as Tom Kelly." "That's what I want," she said. "Look at yourself in the water there," he said, pointing to a little pool left on the top of the rock by the tide. She did so, and saw 2 fiery cheeks, and a forehead divided by a horizontal line into halves of white and crimson. The tip of the nose was blistered. "Isn't it disgraceful?" he suggested. "Why," she exclaimed, "they'll never know me when I get home." It was in such wise that they talked, endlessly exchanging trifles of comment. Anna thought to herself, "Is this love-making?" It could not be, she decided, but she infinitely preferred it so. She was content. She wished for nothing better than this apparently frivolous and irresponsible dalliance. She felt that if Miners were to be tender, sentimental, and serious, she would become wretchedly self-conscious. They re-embarked, and skirting the shore, gradually came round to the beach. Up above them on the cliffs they could discern the industrious figure of Beatrice, with easel and sketching umbrella, and all the panoply of the earnest amateur. "Do you sketch?" she asked him. "Not I," he said scornfully. "Don't you believe in that sort of thing, then?" "It's all right for professional artists," he said. People who can paint. But, well, I suppose it's harmless for the amateurs. Finds them something to do." "I wish I could paint anyway," she retorted. "I'm glad you can't," he insisted. When they got back to the cliffs, towards tea-time, Beatrice was still painting, but in a new spot. She seemed entirely absorbed in her work, and did not hear their approach. "Let's creep up and surprise her," Miners whispered. "You go first, and put your hands over her eyes." "Oh!" exclaimed Beatrice, blindfolded. "How horrid you are, Henry! I know who it is! I know who it is!" "You just don't, then," said Henry, now in front of her. Anna removed her hands. "Well, you told her to do it, I'm sure of that. And I was getting on so splendidly. I shan't do another stroke now." "That's right," said Henry. "You've wasted quite enough time as it is." Beatrice pouted. She was evidently annoyed with both of them. She looked from one to the other, jealous of their mutual understanding and agreement. Mr. and Mrs. Sutton issued from the house, and the five stood chatting till tea was ready, but the shadow remained on Beatrice's face. Miners made several attempts to laugh it away, and at dusk these two went for a stroll to Port St. Mary. They returned in a state of deep intimacy. During supper Beatrice was consciously and elaborately angelic, and there was that in her voice and eyes, when sometimes she addressed Miners, which almost persuaded Anna that he might have once loved his cousin. At night, in the bedroom, Anna imagined that she could detect in Beatrice's attitude the least shade of condescension. She felt hurt, and despised herself for feeling hurt. So the days passed, and without much variety, for the Suttons were not addicted to excursions. Anna was profoundly happy. She had forgotten care. She agreed to every suggestion for amusement. Each moment had its pleasure, and this pleasure was quite independent of the thing done. It sprang from all activities and idleness. She was at special pains to fraternize with Mr. Sutton. He made an interesting companion, full of facts about strata, outcrops, and breaks, his sole weakness being the habit of quoting extremely sentimental scraps of verse when walking by the seashore. He frankly enjoyed Anna's attention to him, and took pride in her society. Mrs. Sutton, that simple heart, devoted herself to the attainment of absolute quiescence. She had come for a rest, and she achieved her purpose. Her kindliness became for the time passive instead of active. Beatrice was a changing quantity in the domestic equation. Plainly, her parents had spoiled their only child, and she had frequent fits of petulance, particularly with Miners, but her energy and spirits atoned well for these. As for Miners, he behaved exactly as on the first Monday. He spent many hours alone with Anna. Beatrice appeared to insist on leaving them together, even while showing a faint resentment at the loneliness thus entailed on herself, and his attitude was such as Anna, ignorant of the ways of brothers, deemed a brother might adopt. On the second Monday an incident occurred. In the afternoon Mr. Sutton had asked Beatrice to go with him to Port St. Mary, and she had refused on the plea that the light was of a suitable gray for painting. Mr. Sutton had slipped off alone, unseen by Anna and Henry, who had meant to accompany him in place of Beatrice. Before tea, while Anna, Beatrice, and Henry were awaiting the meal in the parlor, Miners referred to the matter. "I hope you've done some decent work this afternoon," he said to Beatrice. "I haven't," she replied shortly. "I haven't done a stroke." "But you said you were going to paint hard." "Well, I didn't." "Then why couldn't you have gone to Port St. Mary, instead of breaking your fond father's heart by a refusal?" "He didn't want me, really." Anna interjected, "I think he did, Bee." "You know, you're very self-willed, not to say selfish," Miners said. "No, I'm not," Beatrice protested seriously. "Am I, Anna?" "Well," Anna tried to think of a diplomatic pronouncement. Beatrice took offense at the hesitation. "Oh, you two are bound to agree, of course. You're as thick as thieves." She gazed steadily out of the window, and there was a silence. Miners' lip curled. "Oh, there's the loveliest yacht just coming into the bay!" Beatrice cried suddenly, in a tone of affected enthusiasm. "I'm going out to sketch it." She snatched up her hat and sketching block, and ran hastily from the room. The other two saw her sitting on the grass, sharpening a pencil. The yacht, a large and luxurious craft, had evidently come to anchor for the night. Mrs. Sutton arrived from her bedroom, and then Mr. Sutton also came in. Tea was served. Miners called to Beatrice through the window, and received no reply. Then Mrs. Sutton summoned her. "Go on with your tea," Beatrice shouted, without turning her head. "Don't wait for me. I'm bound to finish this now." "Fetch her, Anna dear," said Mrs. Sutton after another interval. Anna rose to obey, half fearful. "Aren't you coming in, Bee?" She stood by the sketcher's side, and observed nothing but a few meaningless lines on the block. "Didn't you hear what I said to Mother?" Anna retired in discomfiture. Tea was finished. They went out, but kept at a discreet distance from the artist, who continued to use her pencil until dusk had fallen. Then they returned to the sitting-room, where a fire had been lighted, and Beatrice at length followed. As the others sat in a circle round the fire, Beatrice, who occupied the sofa in solitude, gave a shiver. "Beatrice, you've taken cold," said her mother, "sitting out there like that." "Oh, nonsense, mother, what a fidget you are!" "A fidget I certainly am not, my darling, and that you know very well. As you've had no tea, you shall have some gruel at once, and go to bed and get warm." "Oh no, mother!" But Mrs. Sutton was resolved, and in half an hour she had taken Beatrice to bed and tucked her up. When Anna went to the bedroom, Beatrice was awake. "Can't you sleep?" she inquired kindly. "No," said Beatrice in a feeble voice. "I'm restless, somehow." "I wonder if it's influenza," said Mrs. Sutton on the following morning, when she learnt from Anna that Beatrice had had a bad night, and would take breakfast in bed. She carried the invalid's food upstairs herself. "I hope it isn't influenza," she said later. "The girl is very hot." "You haven't a clinical thermometer?" Miner suggested. "Go, see if you can buy one at the little chemist's," she replied eagerly. In a few minutes he came back with the instrument. "She's at over 100, Mrs. Sutton reported, having used the thermometer. "What do you say, father? Shall we send for a doctor? I'm not so set up with doctors as a general rule," she added, as if in defense, to Anna. "I brought Beatrice through measles and scarlet fever without a doctor. We never used to think of having a doctor in those days for ordinary ailments, but influenza, that's different. I dread it. You never know how it will end, and poor Beatrice had such a bad attack last Martinmas." "If you like, I'll run for a doctor now," said Myners. "Let be till tomorrow," the alderman decided. "We'll see how she goes on. Happen it's nothing but a cold." "Yes," assented Mrs. Sutton. "It's no use crying out before you're hurt." Anna was struck by the placidity with which they covered their apprehension. Towards noon, Beatrice, who said that she felt better, insisted on rising. A fire was lighted at once in the parlour, and she sat in front of it till tea-time, when she was obliged to go to bed again. On the Wednesday morning, after a night which had been almost sleepless for both girls, her temperature stood at 103, and Henry fetched the doctor, who pronounced it a case of influenza, severe, demanding very careful treatment. Instantly the normal movement of the household was changed. The sick-room became a mysterious centre round which everything revolved, and the parlour, without the alteration of a single chair, took on a deserted, forlorn appearance. Meals were eaten like the Passover, with loins girded for any sudden summons. Mrs. Sutton and Anna, as nurses, grew important in the eyes of the men, who instinctively effaced themselves, existing only like messenger-boys whose business is to await a call. Yet there was no alarm, flurry, nor excitement. In the evening the doctor returned. The patient's temperature had not fallen. It was part of the treatment that a medicine should be administered every 2 hours with absolute regularity, and Mrs. Sutton said that she should sit up through the night. "I shall do that," said Anna. "Nay, I won't hear of it," Mrs. Sutton replied, smiling. But the three men, the doctor had remained to chat in the parlour, recognizing Anna's capacity and reliability, and perhaps impressed also by her business-like appearance, as, arrayed in a white apron, she stood with firm lips before them, gave a unanimous decision against Mrs. Sutton. "We'st have you ill next, lass," said the alderman to his wife, "and that'll never do." "Well," Mrs. Sutton surrendered, "if I can leave her to anyone, it's Anna." Myners smiled appreciatively. On the Thursday morning there was still no sign of recovery. The temperature was 104, and the patient slightly delirious. Anna left the sick-room at 8 o'clock to preside at breakfast, and Mrs. Sutton took her place. "You look tired, my dear," said the alderman affectionately. "I feel perfectly well," she replied with cheerfulness. "And aren't you afraid of catching it?" Myners asked. "Afraid?" she said. "There's no fear of me catching it." "How do you know?" "I know, that's all. I'm never ill." "That's the right way to keep well," the alderman remarked. The quiet admiration of these two men was very pleasant to her. She felt that she had established herself forever in their esteem. After breakfast, in obedience to them, she slept for several hours on Mrs. Sutton's bed. In the afternoon Beatrice was worse. The doctor called and found her temperature at 105. "This can't last," he remarked briefly. "Well, doctor," Mr. Sutton said, "it's in your hands." "Nay," Mrs. Sutton murmured with a smile, "I've left it with God. It's with Him." This was the first and only word of religion, except grace at table, that Anna heard from the Suttons during her stay in the Isle of Man. She had feared lest vocal piety might form a prominent feature of their daily life, but her fear had proved groundless. She, too, from reason rather than instinct, had tried to pray for Beatrice's recovery. She had, however, found much more satisfaction in the activity of nursing. Again that night she sat up, and on the Friday morning Beatrice was better. At noon all immediate danger was past. The patient slept, her temperature was almost correct. Anna went to bed in the afternoon, and slept soundly till supper-time, when she awoke very hungry. For the first time in 3 days Beatrice could be left alone. The other 4 had supper together, cheerful and relieved after the tension. "She'll be as right as a trivet in a few days," said the alderman. "A few weeks," said Mrs. Sutton. "Of course," said Miners, "you'll stay on here now?" "We shall stay until Beatrice is quite fit to travel," Mr. Sutton answered. "I might have to run over to the 5 Towns for a day or 2 middle of next week, but I can come back immediately." "Well, I must go tomorrow," Miners sighed. "Surely you can stay over Sunday, Henry?" "No, I've no one to take my place at school." "And I must go tomorrow too," said Anna suddenly. "Fiddle-dee-dee, Anna," the alderman protested. "I must," she insisted. "Father will expect me. You know I came for a fortnight. Besides, there's Agnes." "Agnes will be all right." "I must go." They saw that she was fixed. "Won't a short walk do you good?" Miner suggested to her with singular gravity after supper. "You've not been outside for 2 days." She looked inquiringly at Mrs. Sutton. "Yes, take her, Henry. She'll sleep better for it. Anna, but it's a shame to send you home with those rings round your eyes." She went upstairs for a jacket. Beatrice was awake. "Anna," she exclaimed in a weak voice, without any preface, "I was awfully silly and cross the other afternoon, before all this business. Just now, when you came into the room, I was feeling quite ashamed." "Oh, Bea," she answered, bending over her, "what nonsense! Now go off to sleep at once." She was very happy. Beatrice, victim of a temperament which had the childishness and the impulsiveness of the artist without his higher and sterner traits, sank back in facile content. The night was still and very dark. When Anna and Miners got outside they could distinguish neither the sky nor the sea, but the faint, restless murmur of the sea came up the cliffs. Only the lights of the houses disclosed the direction of the road. "Suppose we go down to the jetty, and then along as far as the breakwater," he said, and she concurred. "Won't you take my muffler, again?" he added, pulling this ever-present article from his pocket. "No, thanks," she said, almost coldly. "It's really quite warm." She regarded the offer of the muffler as an indiscretion, his sole indiscretion during their acquaintance. As they walked down the hill to the shore, she thought how Beatrice's illness had sharply interrupted their relations. If she had come to the Isle of Man with a vague idea that he would possibly propose to her, the expectation was disappointed, but she felt no disappointment. She felt that events had lifted her to a higher plane than that of love-making. She was filled with the proud satisfaction of a duty accomplished. She did not seek to minimize to herself the fact that she had been of real value to her friends in the last few days, and probably saved Mrs. Sutton from illness, and certainly laid them all under an obligation. Their gratitude, unexpressed but patent on each face, gave her infinite pleasure. She had won their respect by the manner in which she had risen to the height of an emergency that demanded more than devotion. She had proved, not merely to them but to herself, that she could be calm under stress, and could exert moral force when occasion needed. Such were the joyous and exultant reflections which passed through her brain, unnaturally active in the fictitious wakefulness caused by excessive fatigue. She was in an extremely nervous and excitable condition, and never guessed it, fancying indeed that her emotions were exceptionally tranquil that night. She had not begun to realize the crisis through which she had just lived. The uneven road to the ruined breakwater was quite deserted. Having reached the limit of the path, they stood side by side, solitary, silent, gazing at the black and gently heaving surface of the sea. The eye was foiled by the intense gloom, the ear could make nothing of the strange night noises of the bay and the ocean beyond, but the imagination was stimulated by the appeal of all this mystery and darkness. Never had the waters seemed so wonderful, terrible, and austere. "We are going away tomorrow," he said at length. Anna started and shook with apprehension at the tremor in his voice. She had read that a woman was always well warned by her instincts when a man meant to propose to her. But here was the proposal imminent, and she had not suspected. In a flash of insight she perceived that the very event which had separated them for 3 days had also impelled the lover forward in his course. It was the thought of her vigils, her fortitude, her compassion that had fanned the flame. She was not surprised, only made uncomfortable, when he took her hand. "Anna," he said, "it's no use making a long story of it. I'm tremendously in love with you, you know I am." He stepped back, still holding her hand. She could say nothing. "Well," he ventured, "didn't you know?" I thought, she murmured stupidly, "I thought you liked me. I can't tell you how I admire you. I'm not going to praise you to your face, but I simply never met anyone like you. From the very first moment I saw you, it was the same. It's something in your face, Anna. Anna, will you be my wife?" The actual question was put in a precise, polite, somewhat conventional tone. To Anna he was never more himself than at that moment. She could not speak, she could not analyze her feelings, she could not even think. She was adrift. At last she stammered, "We've only known each other—" "Oh dear!" he exclaimed masterfully. "What does that matter? If it had been a dozen years instead of one, that would have made no difference." She drew her hand timidly away, but he took it again. She felt that he dominated her and would decide for her. "Say yes." "Yes," she said. She saw pictures of her career as his wife, and resolved that one of the first acts of her freedom should be to release Agnes from the more ignominious of her father's tyrannies. They walked home almost in silence. She was engaged then, yet she experienced no new sensation. She felt as she had felt on the way down, except that she was sorely perturbed. There was no ineffable rapture, no ecstatic bliss. Suddenly the prospect of happiness swept over her like a flood. At the gate she wished to make a request to him, but hesitated, because she could not bring herself to use his Christian name. It was proper for her to use his Christian name, however, and she would do so, or perish. "Henry," she said, "don't tell anyone here." He merely kissed her once more. She went straight upstairs. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of Anna of the Five Towns. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 11. The Downfall. In order to catch the Liverpool steamer at Douglas, it was necessary to leave Port Erin at 6:30 in the morning. The freshness of the morning, and the smiles of the alderman and his wife, as they waved Godspeed from the doorstep, filled Anna with a serene content which she certainly had not felt during the wakeful night. She forgot then the hours passed with her conscience in realizing how serious and solemn a thing was this engagement, made in an instant on the previous evening. All that remained in her mind, as she and Henry walked quickly down the road, was the tonic sensation of high resolves to be a worthy wife. The duties, rather than the joys, of her condition had lain nearest her heart until that moment of setting out, giving her an anxious and almost worried mien, which at breakfast neither Henry nor the Suttons could quite understand. But now the idea of duty ceased for a time to be paramount, and she loosed herself to the pleasures of the day in store. The harbor was full of low wandering mists, through which the brown sails of the fishing smacks played at hide and seek. High above them the round forms of immense clouds were still carrying the colors of sunrise. The gentle salt wind on the cheek was like the touch of a life-giver. It was impossible on such a morning not to exult in life, not to laugh childishly from irrational glee, not to dismiss the memory of grief and the apprehension of grief as morbid hallucinations. Miner's face expressed the double happiness of present and anticipated pleasure. He had once again succeeded, he who had never failed, and the voyage back to England was for him a triumphal progress. Anna responded eagerly to his mood. The day was an ecstasy, a bright expanse unstained. To Anna in particular it was a unique day, marking the apogee of her existence. In the years that followed she could always return to it and say to herself, "That day I was happy, foolishly, ignorantly, but utterly, and all that I have since learnt cannot alter it. I was happy." When they reached Shawport station a cab was waiting for Anna. Unknown to her, Henry had ordered it by telegraph. This considerateness was of a piece, she thought, with his masterly conduct of the entire journey. On the steamer, at Liverpool, in the train, nothing that an experienced traveller could devise had been lacking to her comfort. She got into the cab alone, while Minors, followed by a boy and his bag, walked to his rooms in Mount Street. It had been arranged at Anna's wish that he should not appear at Manor Terrace till supper time. Ephraim opened for her the door of her home. It seemed to her that he was pleased. "Well, father, here I am again, you see." "Ay, lass." They shook hands, and she indicated to the cabman where to deposit her tin box. She was glad and relieved to be back. Nothing had changed except herself, and this absolute sameness was at once pleasant and pathetic to her. "Where's Agnes?" she asked, smiling at her father. In the glow of arrival she had a vague notion that her relations with him had been permanently softened by absence. "I see thou's gotten into the habit o' flittin' about in cabs," he said, without answering her question. "Well, father," she said, smiling yet, "there was the box. I couldn't carry the box." "I reckon thou couldst ha' hired a lad to carry it for sixpence." She did not reply. The cabman had gone to his vehicle. "Aren't going to pay the cabby?" "I've paid him, father." "How much?" She paused. 18 pence, father." It was a lie. She had paid 2 shillings. She went eagerly into the kitchen and then into the parlour, where tea was set for one. Agnes was not there. "Her's upstairs," Ephraim said, meeting Anna as she came into the lobby again. She ran softly upstairs and into the bedroom. Agnes was replacing ornaments on the mantelpiece with mathematical exactitude. Under her arm was a duster. The child turned, startled, and gave a little shriek. "Eh? I didn't know you'd come. How early you are!" They rushed towards each other, embraced, and kissed. Anna was overcome by the pathos of her sister's loneliness in that grim house for 14 days, while she, the elder, had been absorbed in selfish gaiety. The pale face, large, melancholy eyes, and long, thin arms were a silent accusation. She wondered that she could ever have brought herself to leave Agnes even for a day. Sitting down on the bed, she drew the child on her knee in a fury of love and kissed her again, weeping. Agnes cried too, for sympathy. "Oh, my dear, dear Anna, I'm so glad you've come back." She dried her eyes and in quite a different tone of voice asked, "Has Mr. Minors proposed to you?" Anna could not avoid a blush at this simple and astounding query. She said, "Yes." It was the one word of which she was capable under the circumstances. That was not the moment to tax Agnes with too much precocity and abruptness. "You're engaged, then? Oh, Anna, does it feel nice?" "It must. I knew you would be." "How did you know, Agnes?" "I mean, I knew he would ask you, some time. All the girls at school knew, too." "I hope you didn't talk about it," said the elder sister. "Oh, no, but they did. They were always talking about it." "You never told me that." I didn't like to. Anna, shall I have to call him Henry now?" "Yes, of course. When we're married he will be your brother-in-law." "Shall you be married soon, Anna?" "Not for a very long time." "When you are, shall I keep house alone? I can, you know. I shall never dare to call him Henry. But he's awfully nice, isn't he, Anna?" "Yes, when you are married. I shall keep house here, but I shall come to see you every day. Father will have to let me do that. Does father know you're engaged?" "Not yet. And you mustn't say anything. Henry is coming for supper, and then father will be told." "Did he kiss you, Anna?" "Who, father?" "No, silly. Henry, of course. I mean when he asked you." I think you are asking all the questions. Suppose I ask you some now. How have you managed with father? Has he been nice?" "Some days, yes," said Agnes, after thinking a moment. "We've had some new cups and saucers up from Mr. Miner's works, and father has swept the kitchen chimney. And, oh, Anna, I asked him to-day if I'd kept house well, and he said, 'Pretty well,' and he gave me a penny. Look, it's the first money I've ever had, you know. I wanted you at nights, Anna, and all the time, too. I've been frightfully busy. I cleaned silvers all afternoon. Anna, I have tried, and I've got some tea for you. I'll go down and make it. Now you mustn't come into the kitchen. I'll bring it to you in the parlor." "I had my tea at Crewe," Anna was about to say, but refrained, in due course drinking the cup prepared by Agnes. She felt passionately sorry for Agnes, too young to feel the shadow which overhung her future. Anna would marry into freedom, but Agnes would remain the serf. Would Agnes marry? Could she? Would her father allow it? Anna had noticed that in families the youngest, petted in childhood, was often sacrificed in maturity. It was the last maid who must keep her maidenhood, and vicariously filial, pay out of her own life the debt of all the rest. "Mr. Miners is coming up for supper tonight. He wants to see you," Anna said to her father, as calmly as she could. The miser grunted. But at 8 o'clock, the hour immutably fixed for supper, Henry had not arrived. The meal proceeded, of course, without him. To Anna his absence was unaccountable and disturbing, for none could be more punctilious than he in the matter of appointments. She expected him every moment, but he did not appear. Agnes, filled full of the great secret confided to her, was more openly impatient than her sister. Neither of them could talk, and a heavy silence fell upon the family group, a silence which her father, on that particular evening of Anna's return, resented. "You dunna tell us much," he remarked when the supper was finished. She felt that the complaint was a just one. Even before supper, when nothing had occurred to preoccupy her, she had spoken little. There had seemed so much to tell at Port Erin, and now there seemed nothing to tell. She ventured into a flaccid, perfunctory account of Beatrice's illness, of the fishing, of the unfinished houses which had caught the fancy of Mr. Sutton. She said the sea had been smooth, that they had had something to eat at Liverpool, that the train for Crewe was very prompt, and then she could think of no more. Silence fell again. The supper things were cleared away and washed up. At 9:15, Agnes, vainly begging permission to stay up in order to see Mr. Miners, was sent to bed, only partially comforted by a clothes-brush, long desired, which Anna had brought for her as a present from the Isle of Man. "Shall you tell father yourself, now Henry hasn't come?" the child asked Anna, who had gone upstairs to unpack her box. "Yes," said Anna briefly. "I wonder what he'll say," Agnes reflected with that habit always annoying to Anna of meeting trouble halfway. At 9:45 Anna ceased to expect Miners, and finally braced herself to the ordeal of a solemn interview with her father, well knowing that she dared not leave him any longer in ignorance of her engagement. Already the old man was locking and bolting the door. He had wound up the kitchen clock. When he came back to the parlor to extinguish the gas, she was standing by the mantelpiece. "Father," she began, "I've something I must tell you." "Eh? What's that ye say?" His hand was on the gas tap. He dropped it, examining her face curiously. "Mr. Miners has asked me to marry him. He asked me last night. We settled he should come up to-night to see you. I can't think why he hasn't. It must be something very unexpected and important, or he'd have come." She trembled. Her heart beat violently, but the words were out, and she thanked God. "Asked ye to marry him, did he? The miser gazed at her quizzically out of his small blue eyes. "Yes, father." "And what didst say?" "I said I would." "Oh, thou saidst thou wouldst? I reckon it was for that'n as thou must go gadding off to seaside, eh?" "Father, I never dreamt of such a thing when Sutton's asked me to go. I do wish Henry, the cost of that Christian name, had come. He quite meant to come tonight." She could not help insisting on the propriety of Henry's intentions. "Then I am for be consulted, eh?" "Of course, father." "You soon made it up between ye." His tone was at the best brusque, but she breathed more easily, divining instantly from his manner that he meant to offer no violent objection to the engagement. She knew that only tact was needed now. The miser had, indeed, foreseen the possibility of this marriage for months past, and had long since decided in his own mind that Henry would make a satisfactory son-in-law. Ephraim had no social ambitions. With all his meanness, he was above them. He had nothing but contempt for rank, style, luxury, and the theory of what it is to be a lady and a gentleman. Yet, by a curious contradiction, Henry's smartness of appearance, the smartness of an unrivaled commercial traveler, pleased him. He saw in Henry a young and sedate man of remarkable shrewdness, a man who had saved money, had made money for others, and was now making it for himself, a man who could be trusted absolutely to perform that feat of getting on, a safe and profoundly respectable man, at the same time audacious and imperturbable. He was well aware that Henry had really fallen in love with Anna, but nothing would have convinced him that Anna's money was not the primal cause of Henry's genuine passion for Anna's self. "You like Henry, don't you, father?" Anna said. It was a failure in the desired tact, for Ephraim had never been known to admit that he liked anyone or anything. Such natures are capable of nothing more positive than toleration. "He's a hard-headed chap, and he knows the value o' money. Aye, that he does. He knows which side his bread's buttered on." A sinister emphasis marked the last sentence. Instead of remaining silent, Anna, in her nervousness, committed another imprudence. "What do you mean, father?" she asked, pretending that she thought it impossible he could mean what he obviously did mean. "Thou knows what I'm at, lass. Dost think he isn't a-marrying thee for thy brass? Dost think as he canna make a fine guess what thou'rt worth? But that wunna bother thee as long as thou's hooked up a good-looking chap." "Father!" "Aye, thou mayst bridle, but it's true. Dunna tell me." Securely conscious of the perfect purity of Miner's affection, she was not in the least hurt. She even thought that her father's attitude was not quite sincere, an attitude partially due to mere wilful churlishness. "Henry has never even mentioned money to me," she said mildly. "Happen not. He isna such a fool as that." He paused and continued, "Thou'rt free to wed. For me, lasses will do it, I reckon, and thee among the rest." She smiled, and on that smile he suddenly turned out the gas. Anna was glad that the colloquy had ended so well. Congratulations, endearments, loving regard for her welfare. She had not expected these things, and was in no wise grieved by their absence. Groping her way towards the lobby, she considered herself lucky, and only wished that nothing had happened to keep Miners away. She wanted to tell him at once that her father had proved tractable. The next morning, Tellwright, whose attendance at chapel was losing the strictness of its old regularity, announced that he should stay at home. Sunday's dinner was to be a cold repast, and so Anna and Agnes went to chapel. Anna's thoughts were wholly occupied with the prospect of seeing Miners, and hearing the explanation of his absence on Saturday night. "There he is!" Agnes exclaimed loudly as they were approaching the chapel. "Agnes," said Anna, "when will you learn to behave in the street?" Miner stood at the chapel gates. He was evidently awaiting them. He looked grave, almost sad. He raised his hat and shook hands with a particular friendliness for Agnes, who was speculating whether he would kiss Anna as his betrothed, or herself as being only a little girl, or both, or neither of them. Her eyes already expressed a sort of ownership in him. "I should like to speak to you a moment," Henry said. "Will you come into the schoolyard?" "Agnes, you had better go straight into chapel," said Anna. It was an ignominious disaster to the child, but she obeyed. "I didn't give you up last night till nearly 10 o'clock," Anna remarked as they passed into the schoolyard. She was astonished to discover in herself an inclination to pout, to play the offended fair one, because Meiners had failed in his appointment. Contemptuously she crushed it. "Have you heard about Mr. Price?" Meiners began. "No. What about him? Has anything happened?" "A very sad thing has happened, yes." He stopped from emotion. "Our superintendent has committed suicide." "Killed himself?" Anna gasped. "He hanged himself yesterday afternoon at Edward Street, in the slip house, after the works were closed. Willie had gone home, but he came back when his father didn't turn up for dinner and found him. Mr. Price was quite dead. He ran into my place to fetch me just as I was getting my tea. That was why I never came last night." Anna was speechless. "I thought I would tell you myself," Henry resumed. "It's an awful thing for the Sunday school, and the whole society, too. He, a prominent Wesleyan, a worker among us. An awful thing," he repeated, dominated by the idea of the blow thus dealt to the Methodist connection by the man now dead. "Why did he do it?" Anna demanded curtly. Miner shrugged his shoulders and ejaculated, "Business troubles, I suppose. It couldn't be anything else. At school this morning I simply announced that he was dead." Henry's voice broke, but he added after a pause, "Young Price bore himself splendidly last night." Anna turned away in silence. "I shall come up for tea if I may," Henry said, and then they parted, he to the singing seat, she to the portico of the chapel. People were talking in groups on the broad steps and in the vestibule. All knew of the calamity and had received from it a new interest in life. The town was aroused as if from a lethargy. Consternation and eager curiosity were on every face. Those who arrived in ignorance of the event were informed of it in impressive tones, and with intense satisfaction to the informer. Nothing of equal importance had happened in the society for decades. Anna walked up the aisle to her pew, filled with one thought. "We drove him to it, Father and I." Her fear was that the miser had renewed his terrible insistence during the previous fortnight. She forgot that she had disliked the dead man, that he had always seemed to her mean, pietistic, and two-faced. She forgot that in pressing him for rent many months overdue, she and her father had acted within their just rights, acted as Price himself would have acted in their place. She could think only of the strain, the agony, the despair that must have preceded the miserable tragedy. Old Price had atoned for all in one sublime sin, the sole deed that could lend dignity and repose to such a figure as his. Anna's feverish imagination reconstituted the scene in the slip house. She saw it as something grand, accusing, and unanswerable, and she could not dismiss a feeling of acute remorse that she should have been engaged in pleasure at that very hour of death. Surely some instinct should have warned her that the hare which she had helped to hunt was at its last gasp. Mr. Sargent, the newly appointed second minister, was in the pulpit, a little earnest bachelor, who emphasized every sentence with a continual tremor of the voice. "Brethren," he said, after the second hymn, and his tones vibrated with a singular effect through the half-empty building. "Before I proceed to my sermon, I have one word to say in reference to the awful event which is doubtless uppermost in the minds of all of you. It is not for us to judge the man who is now gone from us, ushered into the dread presence of his Maker with the crime of self-murder upon his soul. I say it is not for us to judge him. The ways of the Almighty are past finding out. Therefore, at such a moment we may fitly humble ourselves before the throne, and while prostrate there, let us intercede for the poor young man who is left behind bereft and full of grief and shame. We will engage in silent prayer." He lifted his hand and closed his eyes, and the congregation leaned forward against the fronts of the pews. The appealing face of Willie presented itself vividly to Anna. "Who is it?" Agnes asked in a whisper of appalling distinctness. Anna frowned angrily and gave no reply. While the last hymn was being sung, Anna signed to Agnes that she wished to leave the chapel. Every one would be aware that she was among Price's creditors, and she feared that if she stayed till the end of the service, some chatterer might draw her into a distressing conversation. The sisters went out, and Agnes's burning curiosity was at length relieved. "Mr. Price has hanged himself," Anna said to her father when they reached home. The miser looked through the window for a moment. "I am na surprised," he said. "Suicide's i' that blood. Titus's uncle Elijah tried to kill himself twice afore he died o' gravel. Us'll have to do summat wi' Edward Street at last." She wanted to ask Ephraim if he had been demanding more rent lately, but she could not find courage to do so. Agnes had to go to Sunday school alone that afternoon. Without saying anything to her father, Anna decided to stay at home. She spent the time in her bedroom, idle, preoccupied, and did not come downstairs till 3:30. Ephraim had gone out. Agnes presently returned, and then Henry came in with Mr. Tellwright. They were conversing amicably, and Anna knew that her engagement was finally and satisfactorily settled. During tea no reference was made to it, nor to the suicide. Miner's demeanor was quiet but cheerful. He had partly recovered from the morning's agitation, and gave Ephraim and Agnes a vivacious account of the attractions of Port Erin. Anna noticed the amusement in his eye when Agnes, reddening, said to him, "Will you have some more bread and butter, Henry?" It seemed to be tacitly understood afterwards that Agnes and her father would attend chapel, while Henry and Anna kept house. No one was ingenious enough to detect an impropriety in the arrangement. For some obscure reason, immediately upon the departure of the chapel-goers, Anna went into the kitchen, rattled some plates, stroked her hair mechanically, and then stole back again to the parlor. It was a chilly evening, and instead of walking up and down the strip of garden, the betrothed lovers sat together under the window. Anna wondered whether or not she was happy. The presence of Miners was, at any rate, marvelously soothing. "Did your father say anything about the Price affair?" he began, yielding at once to the powerful hypnotism of the subject which fascinated the whole town that night, and which Anna could bear neither to discuss nor to ignore. "Not much," she said, and repeated to him her father's remark. Miners told her all he knew: how Willie had discovered his father with his toes actually touching the floor, leaning slightly forward, quite dead; how he had then cut the rope and fetched Miners, who went with him to the police station; how they had tied up the head of the corpse, and then waited till night to wheel the body on a handcart from Edward Street to the mortuary chamber at the police station; how the police had telephoned to the coroner and settled at once that the inquest should be held on Tuesday in the courtroom at the town hall. And how quiet, self-contained, and dignified Willie had been, surprising everyone by this new-found manliness. It all seemed hideously real to Anna as Henry added detail to detail. "I think I ought to tell you," she said very calmly when he had finished the recital, "that I'm dreadfully upset over it. I can't help thinking that Father and I mean, are somehow partly responsible for this. For Price's death. How? We have been so hard on him for his rent lately, you know." "My dearest girl, what next?" He took her hand in his. "I assure you the idea is absurd. You've only got it because you're so sensitive and high-strung. I undertake to say Price was stuck fast everywhere. Everywhere. Hadn't a chance." "Me? High-strung?" she exclaimed. He kissed her lovingly. But beneath the feeling of reassurance which by superior force he had imposed on her there lay a feeling that she was treated like a frightened child who must be tranquilized in the night. Nevertheless, she was grateful for his kindness, and when she went to bed she obtained relief from the returning obsession of the suicide by making anew her vows to him. As a theatrical effect, the death of Titus Price could scarcely have been surpassed. The town was profoundly moved by the spectacle of this abject yet heroic surrender of all those pretenses by which society contrives to tolerate itself. Here was a man whom no one respected, but every one pretended to respect, who knew that he was respected by none, but pretended that he was respected by all, whose whole career was made up of dissimulations, religious, moral, and social. If any man could have been trusted to continue the decent sham to the end and so preserve the general self-esteem, surely it was this man. But no! Suddenly abandoning all imposture, he transgresses openly, brazenly, and snatching a bit of hemp cries, "Behold me! This is real human nature. This is the truth. The rest was lies. I lied. You lied. I confess it, and you shall confess it." Such a thunderclap shakes the very base of the microcosm. The young folk in particular could with difficulty believe their ears. It seemed incredible to them that Titus Price, the Methodist, the Sunday school superintendent, the loud champion of the highest virtues, should commit the sin of all sins, murder. They were dazed. The remembrance of his insincerity did nothing to mitigate the blow. In their view it was perhaps even worse that he had played false to his own falsity. The elders were a little less disturbed. The event was not unique in their experience. They had lived longer and felt these seismic shocks before. They could go back into the past and find other cases where a swift impulse had shattered the edifice of a lifetime. They knew that the history of families and of communities is crowded with disillusion. They had discovered that character is changeless, irrepressible, incurable. They were aware of the astonishing fact, which takes at least 30 years to learn, that a Sunday school superintendent is a man, and the suicide of Titus Price, when they had realized it, served but to confirm their most secret and honest estimate of humanity, that estimate which they never confided to a soul. The young folk thought the Methodist Society shamed and branded by the tragic incident, and imagined that years must elapse before it could again hold up its head in the town. The old folk were wiser, foreseeing with certainty that in only a few days this all-engrossing phenomenon would lose its significance and be as though it had never been. Even in 2 days time had already begun its work, for by Tuesday morning the interest of the affair, on Sunday at the highest pitch, had waned so much that the thought of the inquest was capable of reviving it. Although everyone knew that the case presented no unusual features, and that the coroner's inquiry would be nothing more than a formal ceremony. The almost greedy curiosity of Methodist circles lifted it to the level of a cause célèbre. The court was filled with irreproachable respectability when the coroner drove into the town, and each animated face said to its fellow, "So you're here, are you?" Late comers of the official world, councilors, guardians of the poor, members of the school board, and one or two of their ladies, were forced to intrigue for room with the police and the town hall keeper, and having succeeded sank into their narrow seats with a sigh of expectancy and triumph. Late comers with less influence had to retire, and by a kind of sinister fascination were kept wandering about the corridor before they could decide to go home. The market-place was occupied by hundreds of loafers, who seemed to find a mystic satisfaction in beholding the coroner's dog-cart and the exterior of the building which now held the corpse. It was by accident that Anna was in the town. She knew that the inquest was to occur that morning, but had not dreamed of attending it. When, however, she saw the stir of excitement in the market-place, and the police guarding the entrances of the town hall, she walked directly across the road, past the two offices at the east door, and into the dark main corridor of the building, which was dotted with small groups idly conversing. She was conscious of two things, a vehement curiosity and the existence somewhere in the precincts of a dead body, unsightly, monstrous, calm, silent, careless, the insensible origin of all this simmering ferment which disgusted her even while she shared in it. At a small door, half hidden by a curtain, she was startled to see Minors. "You here?" he exclaimed, as if painfully surprised, and shook hands with a preoccupied air. "They are examining Willie. I came outside while he was in the witness box." "Is the inquest going on in there?" she asked, pointing to the door. Each appeared to be concealing a certain resentment against the other, but this appearance was due only to nervous agitation. A policeman down the corridor called, "Mr. Minors, a moment." Henry hurried away, answering Anna's question as he went. "Yes, in there. That's the witnesses' and jurors' door. But please don't go in. I don't like you to, and it is sure to upset you." She opened the door and went in. None said nay, and she found a few inches of standing room behind the jury box. A terrible stench nauseated her. The chamber was crammed, and not a window open. There was silence in the court. No one seemed to be doing anything, but at last she perceived that the coroner, enthroned on the bench justice, was writing in a book with blue leaves. In the witness box stood William Price, dressed in black, with kid gloves, not lounging in an ungainly attitude as might have been expected, but perfectly erect. He kept his eyes fixed on the coroner's head. Sarah Vaudrey, Price's aged housekeeper, sat on a chair near the witness box, weeping into a black-bordered handkerchief. At intervals she raised her small, wrinkled, red face, with its glistening, inflamed eyes, and then buried it again in the handkerchief. The members of the jury, whom Anna could see only in profile, shuffled to and fro on their long, pew-like seats. They were mostly working men, shabbily clothed, but the foreman was Mr. Leal, the provision dealer, a Freemason and a sidesman at the parish church. The general public sat intent and vacuous. Their minds gaped, if not their mouths. Occasionally one whispered inaudibly to another. The jury, conscious of an official status, exchanged remarks in a whisper courageously loud. Several tall policemen, helmet in hand, stood in various corners of the room, and the coroner's officer sat near the witness box to administer the oath. At length the coroner lifted his head. He was rather a young man, with a large, intelligent face. He wore eyeglasses, and his chin was covered with a short, wavy beard. His manner showed that, while secretly proud of his supreme position in that assemblage, he was deliberately trying to make it appear that this exercise of judicial authority was nothing to him, that in truth these eternal inquiries, which interested others so deeply, were to him a weariness conscientiously endured. "Now, Mr. Price," the coroner said blandly, and it was plain that he was being ceremoniously polite to an inferior, in obedience to the rules of good form, "I must ask you some more questions. They may be inconvenient, even painful, but I am here simply as the instrument of the law, and I must do my duty. And these gentlemen here," he waved a hand in the direction of the jury, "must be told the whole facts of the case. We know, of course, that the deceased committed suicide. That has been proved beyond doubt. But, as I say, we have the right to know more." He paused, well satisfied with the sound of his voice, and evidently thinking that he had said something very weighty and impressive. "What do you want to know?" Willie Price demanded, his broad Five-Towns speech contrasting with the Kensingtonian accents of the coroner. The latter, who came originally from Manchester, was irritated by the brusque interruption, but he controlled his annoyance, at the same time glancing at the public as if to signify to them that he had learnt not to take too seriously the unintentional rudeness characteristic of their district. "You say it was probably business troubles that caused your late father to commit the rash act?" "Yes." "You are sure there was nothing else?" "What else could there be? Your late father was a widower?" "Yes." "Now, as to these business troubles, what were they?" "We were being pressed by creditors." "Were you a partner with your late father?" "Yes." "Oh, you were a partner with him." The jury seemed surprised, and the coroner wrote again. "What was your share in the business?" "I don't know." "You don't know? Surely that is rather singular." "My father took me into the company not long since. We signed a deed, but I forget what was in it. My place was principally on the bank, not in the office." "And so you were being pressed by creditors?" "Yes, and we were behind with the rent." "Was the landlord pressing you too?" Anna lowered her eyes, fearful lest every head had turned towards her. "Not then. He had been. She, I mean." "The landlord is a lady?" Here the coroner faintly smiled. "Then, as regards the landlord, the pressure was less than it had been?" "Yes, we had paid some rent and settled some other claims." "Does it not seem strange," the coroner began, with a suave air of suggesting an idea. "If you must know," Willie surprisingly burst out, "I believe it was the failure of a firm in London that owed us money that caused father to hang himself." "Ah!" exclaimed the coroner. "When did you hear of that failure?" "By second post on Friday, 11 in the morning." "I think we have heard enough, Mr. Coroner," said Leal, standing up in the jury box. "We have decided on our verdict." "Thank you, Mr. Price," said the coroner, dismissing Willie. He added in a tone of icy severity to the foreman, "I had concluded my examination of the witness." Then he wrote further in his book. "Now, gentlemen of the jury," the coroner resumed, having first cleared his throat, "I think you will agree with me that this is a peculiarly painful case. Yet, at the same time—" Anna hastened from the court as impulsively as she had entered it. She could think of nothing but the quiet, silent, pitiful corpse, and all this vapid mouthing exasperated her beyond sufferance. On the Thursday afternoon Anna was sitting alone in the house with the Persian cat and a pile of stockings on her knee, darning. Agnes had with sorrow returned to school. Ephraim was out. The bell sounded violently, and Anna, thinking that perhaps for some reason her father had chosen to enter by the front door, ran to open it. The visitor was Willie Price. He wore the new black suit which had figured in the coroner's court. She invited him to the parlor, and they both sat down, tongue-tied. Now that she had learnt from his evidence given at the inquest that Ephraim had not been pressing for rent during her absence in the Isle of Man, she felt less like a criminal before Willie than she would have felt without that assurance. But at the best she was nervous, self-conscious, and shamed. She supposed that he had called to make some arrangement with reference to the tenure of the works, or more probably to announce a bankruptcy and stoppage. "Well, Miss Telwright," Willie began, "I've buried him. He's gone." The simple and profound grief and the restrained bitterness against all the world which were expressed in these words, the sole epitaph of Titus Price, nearly made Anna cry. She would have cried if the cat had not opportunely jumped on her knee again. She controlled herself by dint of stroking it. She sympathized with him more intensely in that first moment of his loneliness than she had ever sympathized with anyone, even Agnes. She wished passionately to shield, shelter, and comfort him, to do something, however small, to diminish his sorrow and humiliation, and this despite his size, his ungainliness, his coarse features, his rough voice, his lack of all the conventional refinements. A single look from his guileless and timid eyes atoned for every shortcoming. Yet she could scarcely open her mouth. She knew not what to say. She had no phrases to soften the frightful blow which Providence had dealt him. "I'm very sorry," she said. "You must be relieved it's all over." If she could have been Mrs. Sutton for half an hour. But she was Anna, and her feelings could only find outlet in her eyes. Happily young Price was of those meek ones who know by instinct the language of the eyes. "You've come about the works, I suppose," she went on. "Yes," he said. "Is your father in? I want to see him very particular." "He isn't in now," she replied, "but he will be back by 4 o'clock." "That's an hour. You don't know where he is." She shook her head. "Well," he continued, "I must tell you then. I've come up to do it, and do it I must. I can't come up again, neither can I wait. You remember that bill of exchange as we gave you some weeks back towards rent?" "Yes," she said. There was a pause. He stood up and moved to the mantelpiece. Her gaze followed him intently, but she had no idea what he was about to say. "It's forged, Miss Telwright." He sat down again and seemed calmer, braver, ready to meet any conceivable set of consequences. "Forged?" she repeated, not immediately grasping the significance of the avowal. "Mr. Sutton's name is forged on it, so I came to tell your father. But you'll do as well. I feel as if I should like to tell you all about it," he said, smiling sadly. "Mr. Sutton had really given us a bill for £30, but we'd paid that away when Mr. Telwright sent word down, you remember, that he should put bailiffs in if he didn't have £25 next day. We were just turning the corner then, father said to me. There was a goodish sum due to us from a London firm in a month's time, and if we could only hold out till then, father said he could see daylight for us. But he knew as there'd be no getting round Mr. Telwright, so he had the idea of using Mr. Sutton's name, just temporary like. He sent me to the post office to buy a bill stamp, and he wrote out the bill all but the name. 'You take this up to Telwright's,' he says, 'and ask 'em to take it and hold it, and we'll redeem it, and that'll be all right. No harm done there, Will,' he says. Then he tries Sutton's name on the back of an envelope. It's an easy signature, as you know, but he couldn't do it. 'Here, Will,' he says, 'my old hand shakes. You have a go.' And he gives me a letter of Sutton's to copy from. I did it easy enough after a try or two. 'That'll be all right, Will,' he says, and I put my hat on and brought the bill up here. That's the truth, Miss Telwright. It was the smash of that London firm that finished my poor old father off." Her one feeling was a sense of being herself a culprit. After all, it was her father's action more than anything else that had led to the suicide, and he was her agent. "Oh, Mr. Price," she said foolishly, "whatever shall you do?" "There's nothing to be done," he replied. "It was bound to be. It's our luck. We'd no thought but what we should bring you £30 in cash, and get that bit of paper back and rip it up, and no one the worse. But we were always unlucky, me and him. All you've got to do is just to tell your father, and say I'm ready to go to the police station when he gives the word. It's a bad business, but I'm ready for it." "Can't we do something?" she naively inquired, with a vision of a trial and sentence, and years of prison. "Your father keeps the bill, doesn't he? Not you." "I could ask him to destroy it." "He wouldn't," said Willie. "You'll excuse me saying that, Miss Telwright, but he wouldn't." He rose as if to go, bitterly. As for Anna, she knew well that her father would never permit the bill to be destroyed, but at any cost she meant to comfort him then, to ease his lot, to send him away less grievous than he came. "Listen," she said, standing up and abandoning the cat. "I will see what can be done. Yes, something shall be done, something or other. I will come and see you at the works to-morrow afternoon. You may rely on me." She saw hope brighten his eyes at the earnestness and resolution of her tone, and she felt richly rewarded. He never said another word, but gripped her hand with such force that she flinched in pain. When he had gone, she perceived clearly the dire dilemma, but cared nothing, in the first bliss of having reassured him. During tea it occurred to her that as soon as Agnes had gone to bed she would put the situation plainly before her father, and for the first and last time in her life assert herself. She would tell him that the affair was, after all, entirely her own. She would firmly demand possession of the bill of exchange, and she would insist on it being destroyed. She would point out to the old man that, her promise having been given to Willie Price, no other course than this was possible. In planning this night surprise on her father's obstinacy, she found argument after argument auspicious of its success. The formidable tyrant was at last to meet his equal, in force, in resolution, and in pugnacity. The swiftness of her onrush would sweep him for once off his feet. At whatever cost she was bound to win, even though victory resulted in eternal enmity between father and daughter. She saw herself towering over him, morally, with blazing eye and scornful nostril. And thus, meditating on the grandeur of her adventure, she fed her courage with indignation. By the act of death Titus Price had put her father forever in the wrong. His corpse accused the miser, and Anna, incapable now of seeing aught save the pathos of suicide, acquiesced in the accusation with all the strength of her remorse. She did not reason. She felt. Reason was shriveled up in the fire of emotion. She almost trembled with the urgency of her desire to protect from further shame the figure of Willie Price, so frank, simple, innocent, and big, and to protect also the lifeless and dishonored body of his parent. She reviewed the whole circumstances again and again, each time finding less excuse for her father's implacable and fatal cruelty. So her thoughts ran until the appointed hour of Agnes's bedtime. It was always necessary to remind Agnes of that hour. Left to herself, the child would have stayed up till the very day of judgment. The clock struck, but Anna kept silence. To utter the word bedtime to Agnes was to open the attack on her father, and she felt as a conductor of an opera feels before setting in motion a complicated activity, which may end in either triumph or an unspeakable fiasco. The child was reading. Anna looked and looked at her, and at length her lips were set for the phrase, "Now, Agnes," when suddenly the old man forestalled her. "Is that wench going for sit here all night?" he asked of Anna menacingly. Agnes shut her book and crept away. This accident was the ruin of Anna's scheme. Her father, always the favorite of circumstance, had by chance struck the first blow, ignorant of the battle that awaited him. He had unwittingly won it by putting her in the wrong, as Titus Price had put him in the wrong. She knew in a flash that her enterprise was hopeless. She knew that her father's position in regard to her was impregnable, that no moral force, no consciousness of right, would avail to overthrow that authority which she had herself made absolute by a lifelong submission. She knew that face to face with her father she was, and always would be, a coward. And now, instead of finding arguments for success, she found arguments for failure. She divined all the retorts that he would fling at her. What about Mr. Sutton, in a sense the victim of this fraud? It was not merely a matter of £30. A man's name had been used. Was he, Ephraim Tellwright, and she, his daughter, to connive at a felony? The felony was done and could not be undone. Were they to render themselves liable, even in theory, to a criminal prosecution? If Titus Price had killed himself, what of that? If Willie Price was threatened with ruin, what of that? Them as made the bed must lie on it. At the best, and apart from any forgery, the Prices had swindled their creditors, even in dying. Old Price had been guilty of a commercial swindle, and was the fact that father and son between them had committed a direct and flagrant crime to serve as an excuse for sympathizing with the survivor? Why was Anna so anxious to shield the forger? What claim had he? A forger was a forger, and that was the end of it. She went to bed without opening her mouth, irresolute, shamed, and despairing. She tried to pray for guidance, but she could bring no sincerity of appeal into this prayer. It seemed an empty form. Where, indeed, was her religion? She was obliged to acknowledge that the fervor of her aspirations had been steadily cooling for weeks. She was not a whit more a true Christian now than she had been before the revival. It appeared that she was incapable of real religion, possibly one of those souls foreordained to damnation. This admission added to the general sense of futility and increased her misery. She lay awake for hours, confronting her deliberate promise to Willie Price. Something shall be done. Rely on me. He was relying on her then, but on whom could she rely? To whom could she turn? It is significant that the idea of confiding in Henry Minors did not present itself for a single moment as practical. Minors had been kind to Willie in his trouble, but Anna almost resented this kindness on account of the condescending superiority which she thought she detected therein. It was as though she had overheard Minors saying to himself, "Here is this poor crushed worm. It is my duty as a Christian to pity and succor him. I will do so. I am a righteous man." The thought of anyone stooping to Willie was hateful to her. She felt equal with him, as a mother feels equal with her child when it cries, and she soothes it. And she felt in another way that he was equal with her, as she thought of his sturdy and simple confession, and of the loyal love in his voice when he spoke of his father. She liked him for hurting her hand, and for refusing to snatch at the slender chance of her father's clemency. She could never reveal Willie's sin, if it was a sin, to Henry Minors, that symbol of correctness and of success. She had fraternized with sinners, like Christ, and with amazing injustice she was capable of deeming Minors a Pharisee because she could not find fault with him, because he lived and loved so impeccably and so triumphantly. There was only one person from whom she could have asked advice and help, and that wise and consoling heart was far away in the Isle of Man. "Why won't father give up the bill?" she demanded, half aloud, in sullen wrath. She could not frame the answer in words, but nevertheless she knew it and felt it. Such an act of grace would have been impossible to her father's nature. That was all. Suddenly the expression of her face changed from utter disgust into a bitter and proud smile. Without thinking further, without daring to think, she rose out of bed, and, night-gowned and barefooted, crept with infinite precaution downstairs. The oilcloth on the stairs froze her feet. A cold gray light issuing through the glass square over the front door showed that dawn was beginning. The door of the front parlor was shut. She opened it gently and went within. Every object in the room was faintly visible: the bureau, the chair, the files of papers, the pictures, the books on the mantel-shelf, and the safe in the corner. The bureau, she knew, was never locked. Fear of their father had always kept its privacy inviolate from Anna and Agnes without the aid of a key. As Anna stood in front of it, a shaking figure with her hair hanging loose, she dimly remembered having one day seen a blue paper among white in the pigeonholes. But if the bill was not there, she vowed that she would steal her father's keys while he slept and force the safe. She opened the bureau and at once saw the edge of a blue paper corresponding with her recollection. She pulled it forth and scanned it. 3 months after date, pay to our order. Accepted payable, William Sutton. So here was the forgery. Here the 2 words for which Willie Price might have gone to prison. What a trifle! She tore the flimsy document to bits and crumpled the bits into a little ball. How should she dispose of the ball? After a moment's reflection she went into the kitchen, stretched on tiptoe to reach the matchbox from the high mantelpiece, struck a match, and burnt the ball in the grate. Then, with a restrained and sinister laugh, she ran softly upstairs. "What's the matter, Anna?" Agnes was sitting up in bed, wide awake. "Nothing. Go to sleep and don't bother," Anna angrily whispered. Had she closed the lid of the bureau? She was compelled to return in order to make sure. Yes, it was closed. When at length she lay in bed, breathless, her heart violently beating, her feet like icicles, she realized what she had done. She had saved Willie Price, but she had ruined herself with her father. She knew well that he would never forgive her. On the following afternoon she planned to hurry to Edward Street and back while Ephraim and Agnes were both out of the house. But for some reason her father sat persistently after dinner, conning a sale catalogue. At 2:45 he had not moved. She decided to go at any risks. She put on her hat and jacket and opened the front door. He heard her. "Anna," he called sharply. She obeyed the summons in terror. "Art going out?" "Yes, father." "Where to?" "Downtown to buy some things." "Seem's thou'rt always buying." That was all. He let her free. In an unworthy attempt to appease her conscience, she did in fact go first into the town. She bought some wool. The trick was despicable. Then she hastened to Edward Street. The decrepit works seemed to have undergone no change. She had expected the business would be suspended and Willie Price alone on the bank, but manufacture was proceeding as usual. She went direct to the office, fancying as she climbed the stairs that every window of all the workshops was full of eyes to discern her purpose. Without knocking, she pushed against the unlatched door and entered. Willie was lolling in his father's chair, gloomy, meditative, apparently idle. He was coatless and wore a dirty apron. A battered hat was at the back of his head, and his great hands, which lay on the desk in front of him, were soiled. He sprang up, flushing red, and she shut the door. They were alone together. "I'm all in my dirt," he murmured apologetically. Simple and silly creature, to imagine that she cared for his dirt. "It's all right," she said. "You needn't worry any more. It's all right." They were glorious words for her, and her face shone. "What do you mean?" he asked gruffly. "Why," she smiled, full of happiness, "I got that paper and burnt it." He looked at her exactly as if he had nor understood. "Does your father know?" She still smiled at him happily. "No, but I shall tell him this afternoon. It's all right. I burnt it." He sank down in the chair and, laying his head on the desk, burst into sobbing tears. She stood over him and put a hand on the sleeve of his shirt. At that touch he sobbed more violently. "Mr. Price, what is it?" She asked the question in a calm, soothing tone. He glanced up at her, his face wet, yet apparently not shamed by the tears. She could not meet his gaze without herself crying, and so she turned her head. "I was only thinking," he stammered. "Only thinking. What an angel you are!" Only the meek, the timid, the silent can, in moments of deep feeling, use this language of hyperbole without seeming ridiculous. He was her great child, and she knew that he worshipped her. O ineffable power that out of misfortune canst create divine happiness! Later he remarked in his ordinary tone, "I was expecting your father here this afternoon about the lease. There is to be a deed of arrangement with the creditors." "My father!" she exclaimed, and she bade him good-bye. As she passed under the archway she heard a familiar voice. "I reckon I shall find young Mr. Price in the office." Ephraim, who had wandered into the packing-house, turned and saw her through the doorway. A second's delay and she would have escaped. She stood waiting the storm, and then they walked out into the road together. "Anna, what art doing here?" She did not know what to say. "What art doing here?" he repeated coldly. "Father, I was just going back home." He hesitated an instant. "I'll go with thee," he said. They walked back to Manor Terrace in silence. They had tea in silence, except that Agnes, with dreadful inopportuneness, continually worried her father for a definite promise that she might leave school at Christmas. The idea was preposterous, but Agnes, fired by her recent success as a housekeeper, clung to it. Ignorant of her imminent danger, and misinterpreting the signs of his face, she at last pushed her insistence too far. "Get to bed this minute," he said in a voice suddenly terrible. She perceived her error then, but it was too late. Looking wistfully at Anna, the child fled. "I was told this morning, miss," Ephraim began, as soon as Agnes was gone, "that young Price had been seen coming to this house ere yesterday afternoon. I thought as it was strange as thou said nowt about it to thy feyther, but I never suspected as a daughter of mine was up to any tricks. There was a hang-dog look on thy face this afternoon when I asked where thou wast going, but I didna think thou wast lying to me." "I wasn't," she began, and stopped. "Thou was. Now what is it? What's this carrying on between thee and Will Price? I'll have it out of thee." "There is no carrying on, father." "Then why hast thou gotten secrets? Why dost go sneaking about to see him? Sneaking, creeping, like any brazen Moll." The miser was wounded in the one spot where there remained to him any sentiment capable of being wounded, his faith in the irreproachable absolute chastity, in thought and deed, of his womankind. "Willie Price came in here yesterday," Anna began, white and calm, "to see you. But you weren't in, so he saw me. He told me that bill of exchange, that blue paper for £30, was forged. He said he had forged Mr. Sutton's name on it." She stopped, expecting the thunder. "Get on with thy tale," said Ephraim, breathing loudly. "He said he was ready to go to prison as soon as you gave the word, but I told him no such thing. I said it must be settled quietly. I told him to leave it to me. He was driven to the forgery, and I thought—" "Dost mean to say," the miser shouted, "as that blasted scoundrel came here and told thee he'd forged a bill, and thou told him to leave it to thee to settle?" Without waiting for an answer he jumped up and strode to the door, evidently with the intention of examining the forged document for himself. "It isn't there! It isn't there!" Anna called to him wildly. "What isna there?" "The paper. I may as well tell you, father. I got up early this morning and burnt it." The man was staggered at this audacious and astounding impiety. "It was mine, really," she continued, "and I thought—" "Thou thought?" Agnes, upstairs, heard that passionate and consuming roar. "Shame on thee, Anna Tellwright! Shame on thee for a shameless hussy! A daughter o' mine, and just promised to another man! Thou'rt an accomplice in forgery? Thou seized the scamp on the sly? Thou—" He paused, and then added with furious scorn, "Shalt speak o' this to Henry Mynors?" "I will tell him if you like," she said proudly. "Look thee here," he hissed. "If thou breathes a word of this to Henry Mynors, or any other man, I'll cut thy tongue out. A daughter of mine, if thou breathes a word." "I shall not, father." It was finished. Gray with frightful anger, Ephraim left the room. End of chapter 11. Recording by James O'Connor, Randolph, Massachusetts, October 2009.
Chapter 12 of Anna of the Five Towns. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Monique Michener. Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 12. At the Prairie. She was not to be pardoned. The offense was too monstrous, daring, and final. At the same time, the unappeasable ire of the old man tended to weaken his power over her. All her life she had been terrorized by the fear of a wrath which had never reached the superlative degree until that day. Now that she had seen and felt the limit of his anger, she became aware that she could endure it. The curse was heavy, and perhaps more irksome than heavy, but she survived. She continued to breathe, eat, drink, and sleep. Her father's power stopped short of annihilation. Here, too, was a satisfaction that things could not be worse. And still greater comfort lay in the fact that she had not only accomplished the deliverance, and still greater comfort lay in the fact that she had not only accomplished the deliverance of Willie Price, but had secured absolute secrecy concerning the episode. The next day was Saturday, when after breakfast it was Ephraim's custom to give Anna the weekly sovereign for housekeeping. "Here, Agnes," he said, turning in his armchair to face the child, and drawing a sovereign from his waistcoat pocket, "take charge of this, and mind ye make it go as far as ye can." His tone conveyed a subsidiary message. "I am terribly angry, but I am not angry with you. However, behave yourself." The child mechanically took the coin, scared by this proof of an unprecedented domestic convulsion. Anna, with a tightening of the lips, rose and went into the kitchen. Agnes followed, after a discreet interval, and in silence gave up the sovereign. "What is it all about, Anna?" she ventured to ask that night. "Never mind," said Anna curtly. The question had never needed some courage, for at certain times Agnes would as easily have trifled with her father as with Anna. From that moment, with the passive fatalism characteristic of her years, Agnes's spirits began to rise again to the normal level. She accepted the new situation and fitted herself into it with a child's adaptability. If Anna naturally felt a slight resentment against this too impartial and apparently callous attitude on the part of the child, she never showed it. Nearly a week later, Anna received a postcard from Beatrice announcing her complete recovery and the immediate return of her parents and herself to Bursley. That same afternoon, a cab encumbered with much luggage passed up the street as Anna was fixing clean curtains in her father's bedroom. Beatrice, on the lookout, waved a hand and smiled, and Anna responded to the signals. She was glad now that the Suttons had come back. though for several days she had almost forgotten their existence. On the Saturday afternoon, Miners called. Anna was in the kitchen. She heard him scuffling with Agnes in the lobby, and then talking to her father. 3 times she had seen him since her disgrace, and each time the secret bitterness of her soul, despite conscientious effort to repress it, had marred the meeting. It had been plain, indeed, that she was profoundly disturbed. He had affected at first not to observe the change in her, and she anticipated his questions, hinted briefly that the trouble was with her father, and had no reference to himself, and that she preferred not to discuss it at all. Reassured, and too young in courtship yet to presume on a lover's rights, he respected her wish, and endeavored by every art to restore her to equanimity. This time, as she went to greet him in the parlor, she resolved that he should see no more of the shadow. He noticed instantly the difference in her face. "I've come to take you into Sutton's for tea and for the evening," he said eagerly. "You must come. They are very anxious to see you. I've told your father," he added. Ephraim had vanished into his office. "What did he say, Henry?" she asked timidly. "He said you must please yourself, of course. Come along, love. Mustn't she, Agnes?" Agnes concurred and said that she would get her father's tea and his supper too. "You will come," he urged. She nodded, smiling thoughtfully, and he kissed her for the first time in front of Agnes, who was filled with pride at this proof of their confidence in her. "I'm ready, Henry," Anna said, a quarter of an hour later, and they went across to Sutton's. "Anna, tell me all about it," Beatrice burst out when she and Anna had fled to her bedroom. "I'm so glad. Do you love him really, truly?" "He's dreadfully fond of you. He told me so this morning. We had quite a long chat in the market. I think you're both very lucky, you know." She kissed Anna effusively for the 3rd time. Anna looked at her smiling but silent. "Well," Beatrice said, "what do you want me to say?" "Oh, you are the funniest girl, Anna, I ever met." "What do you want me to say, indeed?" Beatrice added in a different tone. "Don't imagine this affair was the least bit of a surprise to us. It wasn't. The fact is, Henry had— oh, well, never mind. Do you know, Mother and Dad used to think there was something between Henry and me, but there wasn't. You know, not really. I tell you that so that you won't be able to say you were kept in the dark. When shall you be married, Anna?" "I haven't the least idea," Anna replied, and began to question Beatrice about her convalescence. "I'm perfectly well," Beatrice said. "It's always the same. If I catch anything, I catch it bad and get it over quickly." "Now, how long are you 2 chatterboxes going to stay here?" It was Mrs. Sutton who came into the room. "Bea, you've got those sewing meeting letters to write." Anna, but I'm glad of this. You'll make him a good wife. You two'll just suit each other." Anna could not but be impressed by this unaffected joy of her friends in the engagement. Her spirits rose, and once more she saw visions of future happiness. At tea, Alderman Sutton added his felicitations to the rest, with that flattering air of intimate sympathy and comprehension which some middle-aged men can adopt towards young girls. The tea made specially magnificent in honor of the betrothal was such a meal as could only have been compassed in Staffordshire or Yorkshire, a high tea of the last richness and excellence, exquisitely gracious to the palate, but ruthless in its demands on the stomach. At one end of the table, which glittered with silver, glass, and Longshaw china, was a fowl which had been boiled for 4 hours. At the other, a hot pork pie islanded in liquor, which might have satisfied a regiment. Between these two dishes were all the delicacies which differentiate high tea from tea, and on the quality of which the success of the meal really depends. Hot pikelets, hot crumpets, hot toast, sardines with tomatoes, raisin bread, currant bread, seed cake, lettuce, homemade marmalade, and homemade jams. The repast occupied over an hour, and even then not a quarter of the food was consumed. Surrounded by all that good fare and goodwill, with the alderman on her left, Henry on her right, and a bright fire in front of her, Anna quickly caught the gaiety of the others. She forgot everything but the gladness of reunion, the joy of the moment, the luxurious comfort of the house. Conversation was busy with the doings of the Suttons at Port Erin after Anna and Henry had left. A listener would have caught fragments like this: "You know such and such a point." "No, not there, over the hill." "Well, we hired a carriage and drove." The weather was simply, "Tom Kelly said he'd never." "And that little guard on the railway came all the way down to the steamer." "Did you see anything in the Signal about the actress being drowned?" "Oh, it was awfully sad. We saw the corpse just after." "Beatrice, will you hush?" "Wasn't it terrible about Titus Price?" Beatrice exclaimed. My," sighed Mrs. Hutton, glancing at Anna. "You can never tell what's going to happen next. I'm always afraid to go away for the fear of something happening." A silence followed. When tea was finished, Beatrice was taken away by her mother to write the letters concerning the immediate resumption of sewing meetings, and for a little time Anna was left in the drawing-room alone with the two men, who began to talk about the affairs of the Prices. It appeared that Mr. Sutton had been asked to become trustee for the creditors under a deed of arrangement, and that he had hopes of being able to sell the business as a going concern. In the meantime, it would need careful management. "Will Willie Price manage it?" Anna inquired. The question seemed to divert Henry and the alderman, to afford them a contemptuous and somewhat inimical amusement at the expense of Willie. "No," said the alderman, quietly but emphatically. "Master William is fairly good on the works," said Henry, "but in the office, I imagine, he is worse than useless." Grieved and confused, Anna bent down and moved a hassock in order to hide her face. The attitude of these men to Willie Price, that victim of circumstances and of his own simplicity, wounded Anna inexpressibly. She perceived that they could see in him only a defaulting debtor, that his misfortune made no appeal to their charity. She wondered that men so warm-hearted and kind in some relations could be so hard in others. "I had a talk with your father at the creditors' meeting yesterday," said the alderman. "You won't lose much. Of course you've got a preferential claim for 6 months' rent." He said this reassuringly, as though it would give satisfaction. Anna did not know what a preferential claim might be, nor was she aware of any creditors' meeting. She wished ardently that she might lose as much as possible, hundreds of pounds. She was relieved when Beatrice swept in, her mother following. "Now, your worship," said Beatrice to her father, 7 stamps for these letters, please." Anna glanced up inquiringly on hearing the form of address. "You don't mean to say that you don't know that father is going to be mayor this year?" Beatrice asked, as if shocked at this ignorance of affairs. "Yes, it was all settled rather late, wasn't it, Dad? And the mayor-elect pretends not to care much, but actually he is filled with pride, isn't he, Dad? As for the mayoress—" "A.B." Mrs. Sutton stopped her, smiling. You'll tumble over that tongue of yours some day." "Mother said I wasn't to mention it," said Beatrice, "lest you should think we were putting on airs." "Nay, not I," Mrs. Sutton protested. "I said no such thing. Anna knows us too well for that. But I'm not so set up with this mayor business as some people will think I am." "Or as Beatrice is," Miners added. At 8:30, and again at 9, Anna said that she must go home, but the Suttons, now frankly absorbed in the topic of the mayoralty, their secret preoccupation, would not spoil the confidential talk which had ensued by letting the lovers depart. It was nearly 9:30 before Anna and Henry stood on the pavement outside, and Beatrice, after facetious farewells, had shut the door. "Let us just walk round by the Manor Farm," Henry pleaded. "It won't take more than a quarter of an hour or so." She agreed dutifully. The footpath ran at right angles to Trafalgar Road, past a colliery whose engine fires glowed in the dark, moonless autumn night, and then across a field. They stood on a knoll near the old farmstead, the extraordinary and pathetic survival of a vanished agriculture. Immediately in front of them stretched acres of burning ironstone, a vast tremulous carpet of flame woven in red, purple, and strange greens. Beyond were the skeleton-like silhouettes of pit heads and the solid forms of furnace and chimney shaft. In the distance, a canal reflected the gigantic illuminations of Caldon Bar ironworks. It was a scene mysterious and romantic enough to kindle the raptures of love, but Anna felt cold, melancholy, and apprehensive of vague sorrows. "Why am I so?" she asked herself, and tried in vain to shake off the mood. "What will Willie Price do if the business is sold?" she questioned Miners suddenly. "Surely," he said to soothe her, "you aren't still worrying about that misfortune. I wish you had never gone near the inquest. The thing seems to have got on your mind." "Oh, no," she protested with an air of cheerfulness. "But I was just wondering." "Well, Willie will have to do the best he can. Get a place somewhere, I suppose. It won't be much, at the best." Had he guessed what perhaps hung on that answer, Miners might have given it in a tone less callous and perfunctory. Could he have seen the tightening of her lips, he might even afterwards have repaired his error by some voluntary assurance that Willie Price should be watched over with a benevolent eye and protected with a strong arm. But how was he to know that in misprizing Willie Price before her, he was misprizing a child to his mother? He had done something for Willie Price, and considered that he had done enough. His thoughts, moreover, were on other matters. "Do you remember that day we went up to the park?" he murmured fondly. "That Sunday? I have never told you that evening I came out of chapel after the first hymn, when I noticed you weren't there, and walked up past your house. I couldn't help it. Something drew me. I nearly called in to see you, then I thought I had better not." "I saw you," she said calmly. His warmth made her feel sad. "I saw you stop at the gate." "You did? But you weren't at the window." "I saw you through the glass of the front door." Her voice grew fainter and more reluctant. "Then you were watching." In the dark he seized her with such violence and kissed her so vehemently that she was startled out of herself. "Oh, Henry!" she exclaimed. "Call me Harry," he entreated, his arm still round her waist. "I want you to call me Harry. No one else does or ever has done, and no one shall now." "Harry," she deliberately, bracing her mind to a positive determination. She must please him, and she said it again. Harry, yes. It has a nice sound. Ephraim sat reading the signal in the parlor when she arrived home at 5 minutes to 10. Imbued then with ideas of duty, submission, and systematic kindliness, she had an impulse to attempt a reconciliation with her father. "Good night, Father," she said. "I hope I've not kept you up." He was deaf. She went to bed resigned, sad but not gloomy. It was not for nothing that during all her life she had been accustomed to infelicity. Experience had taught her this, to be the mistress of herself. She knew that she could face any fact, even the fact of her dispassionate frigidity under Miners's caresses. It was on the firm, almost rapturous resolve to succor Willie Price, if need be, that she fell asleep. The engagement, which had hitherto been kept private, became the theme of universal gossip immediately upon the return of the Suttons from the Isle of Man. 2 words let fall by Beatrice in the St. Luke's covered market on Saturday morning had increased and multiplied till the whole town echoed with the news. Anna's private fortune rose as high as $250,000. As for Henry Miners, it was said that Henry Miners knew what he was about. After all, he was like the rest. Money, money. Of course, it was inconceivable that a fine, prosperous figure of a man, such as Miners, would have made up to her if she had not been simply rolling in money. Well, there was one thing to be said for young Miners. He would put money to good use. You might rely he would not hoard it up same as it had been hoarded up. However, the more saved, the more for young Miners, so he needn't grumble. It was to be hoped he would make her dress herself a bit better, though indeed it hadn't been her fault she went about so shabby. The old skinflint would never allow her a penny of her own, so tongues wagged. The first Sunday was a tiresome ordeal for Anna, both at school and at chapel. "Well, I never!" seemed to be written like a note of exclamation on every brow. The monotony of the congratulations fatigued her, as much as her involuntary efforts to grasp what each speaker had left unsaid of innuendo, malice, envy, or sycophancy. Even the people in the shops during the next few days could not serve her without direct and curious reference to her private matters. The general opinion that she was a cold and bloodless creature was strengthened by her attitude at this period. But the apathy which she displayed was neither affected nor due to an excessive diffidence. As she seemed, so she felt. She often wondered what would have happened to her if that vague something between Henry and Beatrice, to which Beatrice had confessed, had ever taken definite shape. "Hancock came back from Lancashire last night," said Miners, when he arrived at Manor Terrace on the next Saturday afternoon. Ephraim was in the room, and Henry, evidently joyous and triumphant, addressed both him and Anna. "Is Hancock the commercial traveler?" Anna asked. She knew that Hancock was the commercial traveler, but she experienced a nervous compulsion to make idle remarks in order to hide the breach of intercourse between her father and herself. "Yes," said Miners, "he had a magnificent journey." "How much?" asked the miser. Henry named the amount of orders taken in a fortnight's journey. "Humph!" the miser ejaculated. "That's better than a bat in the eye with a burnt stick." From him this was the superlative of praise. "You're making good money at any rate." "We are," said Miners. "That reminds me," Ephraim remarked gruffly. "When dost thou think of getting wed?" "I'm not much for long engagements, and so I tell ye." He threw a cold glance sideways at Anna. The idea penetrated her heart like a stab. He wants to get me out of the house. Well, said Miners, surprised at the question and the tone, and looking at Anna as if for an explanation. I had scarcely thought of that. What does Anna say? I don't know, she murmured, and then more bravely, in a louder voice, and with a smile. The sooner the better, she thought in her bitter and painful resentment. If he wants me to go, go I will. Henry tactfully passed on to another phase of the subject. I met Mr. Sutton yesterday, and he was telling me of Price's house up at Toft End. It belonged to Mr. Price, but of course it was mortgaged up to the hilt. The mortgagees have taken possession, and Mr. Sutton said it would be to let cheap at Christmas. Of course Willie and old Sarah Vaudrey, the housekeeper, would clear out. I was thinking it might do for us. It's not a bad sort of house, or rather, it won't be when it's repaired. What will they ask for it? Ephraim inquired. 25 or 28. It's a nice large house, 4 bedrooms, and a very good garden. 4 bedrooms, the miser exclaimed. What dost want with 4 bedrooms? You'd have for keep a servant. Naturally we should keep a servant, Miner said with calm politeness. You could get one of them new houses up by the park for £15, as would do you well enough. The miser protested against these dreams of extravagance. I don't care for that part of the town, said Miners. It's too new for my taste. After tea, when Henry and Anna went out for their Saturday evening stroll, Miners suddenly suggested, Why not go up and look through that house of Price's? Won't it seem like turning them out if we happen to take it? She asked. Turning them out? Willie is bound to leave it. What use it to him? Besides, it's in the hands of the mortgagees now. Why shouldn't we take it just as well as anybody else, if it suits us? Anna had no reply, and she surrendered herself placidly enough to his will. Nevertheless, she could not entirely banish a misgiving that Willie Price was again to be victimized. Infinitely more disturbing than this illogical sensation, however, was the instinctive and sure knowledge, revealed in a flash, that her father wished to be rid of her. So implacable, then, was his animosity against her. Never, never had she been so deeply hurt. The wound, in fact, was so severe that at first she felt only a numbness that reduced everything to unimportance, robbing her of volition. She walked up to Toft End as if walking in her sleep. Price's house, sometimes called Priory House, in accordance with the legend that a priory had once occupied the site, stood in the middle of the mean and struggling suburb of Toft End, which was flung up the hillside like a ragged scarf. Built of red brick, towards the end of the 18th century, double-fronted with small, evenly disposed windows, and a chimney stack at either side, it looked westward over the town smoke towards a horizon of hills. It had a long, narrow garden, which ran parallel with the road. Behind it, adjoining, was a small, disused pot-works, already advanced in decay. On the north side, and enclosed by a brick wall, which surrounded also the garden, was a small orchard of sterile and withered fruit trees. In parts the wall had crumbled under the assaults of generations of boys, and from the orchard through the gaps could be seen an expanse of gray-green field with a few abandoned pit shafts scattered over it. These shafts, imperfectly protected by ruinous masonry, presented an appearance strangely sinister and forlorn, raising visions in the mind of dark and mysterious depths, peopled with miserable ghosts of those who had toiled there in the days when to be a miner was to be a slave. The whole place, house and garden, looked ashamed and sad, with a shabby mournfulness acquired gradually from its inmates during many years, but nevertheless the house was substantial, and the air on that height fresh and pure. Miners rang in vain at the front door, and then they walked round the house to the orchard, and discovered Sarah Vawdrey taking in clothes from a line, a diminutive and wasted figure with scanty gray hair, a tiny face permanently soured, and bony hands contorted by rheumatism. "My rheumatism's that bad," she said in response to greetings. "I can scarce move about, and this house is a regular barracks to keep clean." "No, Willie's not in. He's at the works as usual. Saturday like any other day. I'm by myself here all day and every day. But I reckon us'll be fitting soon. And me lived here 28 years. Praise God, there's a mansion up there for me at last, and not sorry shall I be when he calls." "It must be very lonely for you, Miss Vawdrey," said Miners. He knew exactly how to speak to this dame who lived her life like a fly between two panes of glass, and who could find room in her head for only 3 ideas, namely, that God and herself were on terms of intimacy, that she was and had always been indispensable to the Price family, and that her social status was far above that of a servant. "It's a pity you never married," Miners added. "Me marry? What would they have done without me? No, I'm no for marriage and never was. I'd be shamed to be like some of them spinsters down at chapel, always hang around chapel yard on the off chance of a service, to catch that there young Mr. Sargent, the new minister. It's a sign of a hard winter, Miss Terrick. When the hay runs after the horse, that's what I say." "Miss Tellwright and myself are in search of a house," Miners gently interrupted the flow and gave her a peculiar glance which she appreciated. "We heard you and Willie were going to leave here, and so we came up just to look over the place, if it's quite convenient to you." I understand ye," she said. "Come in, but ye mun take things as ye find 'em, Miss Terrick." Dismal and unkempt, the interior of the house matched the exterior. The carpets were threadbare, the discolored wallpapers hung loose on the walls, the ceilings were almost black, the paint had nearly been rubbed away from the woodwork, the exhausted furniture looked as if it would fall to pieces in despair if compelled to face the threatened ordeal of an auction sale. But to Anna the rooms were surprisingly large, and there seemed so many of them. It was as if she were exploring an immense abode, like a castle, with odd chambers continually showing themselves in unexpected places. The upper story was even less inviting than the ground floor, barer, more chill, utterly comfortless. "This is the best bedroom," said Miss Vawdrey, "and a rare big room, too. It's not used now. He slept here, Willie sleeps at back." "A very nice room," Miners agreed blandly, and measured it, as he had done all the others, with a 2-foot, entered the figures in his pocketbook. Anna's eyes wandered uneasily across the room, with its dismantled bed and decrepit mahogany suite. "I'm glad he hanged himself at the works, and not here," she thought. Then she looked out at the window. "What a splendid view," she remarked to Miners. She saw that he had taken a fancy to the house. The sagacious fellow esteemed it, not as it was, but as it would be, repapered, repainted, refurnished, the outer walls pointed, the garden stocked, everything cleansed, brightened, renewed. And there was indeed much to be said for his fancy. The house was large, with plenty of ground. The boundary wall secured that privacy which young husbands and young wives instinctively demand. The outlook was unlimited, the air the purest in the 5 towns, and the rent was low, because the great majority of those who could afford such a house would never deign to exist in a quarter so poverty-stricken and unfashionable. After leaving the house, they continued their walk up the hill, and then turned off to the left on the high road from Hanbridge to Moorthorne. The venerable but not dignified town lay below them, a huddled medley of brown brick under a thick black cloud of smoke. The gold angel of the town hall gleamed in the evening light, and the dark, squat tower of the parish church, sole relic of the past, stood out grim and obdurate amid the featureless buildings which surrounded it. To the north and east miles of moorland, defaced by collieries and murky hamlets, ran to the horizon. Across the great field at their feet, a figure slouched along past the abandoned pit shafts. They both recognized the man. "There's Willie Price going home," said Miners. "He looks tired," she said. She was relieved that they had not met him at the house. "I say," Miners began earnestly, after a pause, "why shouldn't we get married soon, since the old gentleman seems rather to expect it? He's been rather awkward lately, hasn't he?" This was the only reference made by Miners to her father's temper. She nodded. "How soon?" she asked. "Well, I was just thinking, suppose, for the sake of argument, this house turns out all right. I couldn't get it thoroughly done up much before the middle of January. Couldn't begin till these people had moved. Suppose we said early in February." "Yes." "Could you be ready by that time?" "Oh, yes," she answered, "I could be ready." "Well, why shouldn't we fix February then?" "There's the question of Agnes," she said. "Yes, and there will always be the question of Agnes. Your father will have to get a housekeeper. You and I will be able to see after little Agnes, never fear." So with tenderness in his voice, he reassured her on that point. "Why not February?" she reflected. "Why not tomorrow, as father wants me out of the house?" It was agreed. "I've taken the Priory, subject to your approval," Henry said, less than a fortnight later. From that time he invariably referred to the place as the Prairie. It was on the very night after this eager announcement that the approaching tragedy came one step nearer. Beatrice, in a modest evening dress, with a white cloak, excited, hurried, and important, ran in to speak to Anna. The carriage was waiting outside. She and her father and mother had to attend a very important dinner at the mayor's house at Hillport, in connection with Mr. Sutton's impending mayoralty. Old Sarah Vawdrey had just sent down a girl to say that she was unwell, and would be grateful if Mrs. Sutton or Beatrice would visit her. It was a most unreasonable time for such a summons, but Sarah was a fidgety old crotchet, and knew how frightfully good-natured Mrs. Sutton was. Would Anna mind going up to Toft End? And would Anna come out to the carriage and personally assure Mrs. Sutton that old Sarah should be attended to? If not, Beatrice was afraid her mother would take it into her head to do something stupid. "It's very good of you, Anna," said Mrs. Sutton, when Anna went outside with Beatrice. "But I think I'd better go myself. The poor old thing may feel slighted if I don't, and Beatrice can well take my place at the fair at Hillport, which I've no mind for." She was already half out of the carriage. "Nothing of the kind," said Anna firmly, pushing her back. "I shall be delighted to go and do what I can." "That's right, Anna," said the alderman from the darkness of the carriage, where his shirt front gleamed. "Bee said you'd go, and we're much obliged to ye." "I expect it will be nothing," said Beatrice, as the vehicle drove off. "Sarah has served mother this trick before now." As Anna opened the garden gate of the priory, she discerned a figure amid the rank bushes, which had been allowed to grow till they almost met across the narrow path leading to the front door of the house. It was a thick and mysterious night, such a night as death chooses, and Anna jumped in vague terror at the apparition. "Who's there?" said a voice sharply. "It's me," said Anna. "Miss Vawdrey sent down to ask Mrs. Sutton to come up and see her, but Mrs. Sutton had an engagement, so I came instead." The figure moved forward. It was Willie Price. He peered into her face, and she could see the mortal pallor of his cheeks. "Oh," he exclaimed, "it's Miss Tellwright, is it? Will ye come in, Miss Tellwright?" She followed him with beating heart, alarmed, apprehensive. The front door stood wide open, and at the far end of the gloomy passage a faint light shone from the open door of the kitchen. "This way," he said. In the large, bare, stone-floored kitchen, Sarah Vawdrey sat limp and with closed eyes in an old rocking chair close to the fireless range. The window, which gave on to the street, was open. Through that window, Sarah, in her extremity, had called the child who ran down to Mrs. Sutton's. On the deal table were a dirty cup and saucer, a teapot, bread, butter, and a lighted candle, sole illumination of the chamber. "I come home, and I find this," he said. Daunted for a moment by the scene of misery, Anna could say nothing. "I find this," he repeated, as if accusing God of spitefulness, and he lifted the candle to show the apparently insensible form of the woman. Sarah's wrinkled and seamed face had the flush of fever, and the features were drawn into the expression of a terrible anxiety. Her hands hung loose. She breathed like a dog after a run. "I wanted her to have the doctor yesterday," he said, "but she wouldn't. Ever since you and Mr. Miners called, she's been cleaning the house down. She said you'd happen be coming again soon, and the place wasn't fit to be seen. No use me arguing with her. You had better run for a doctor," Anna said. "I was just going off when you came. She's been complaining more of her rheumatism and pain in her hips lately. Go now, fetch Mr. McPherson, and call at our house and say I shall stay here all night. Wait a moment." Seeing that he was exhausted from lack of food, she cut a thick piece of bread and butter. "Eat this as you go," she said. "I can't eat. It'll choke me." "Let it choke you," she said. "You've got to swallow it." Child of 100 sorrows, he must be treated as a child. As soon as Willie was gone, she took off her hat and jacket and lit a lamp. There was no gas in the kitchen. "What's that light?" the old woman asked peevishly, rousing herself and sitting up. "I doubt I'll be late with Willie's tea. Miss Terrick, what's amiss?" "You're not quite well, Miss Vawdrey," Anna answered. "If you'll show me your room, I'll see you into bed." Without giving her a moment for hesitation, Anna seized the feeble creature under the arms, and so coaxing, supporting, carrying, got her to bed. At length she lay on the narrow mattress, panting, exhausted. It was Sarah's final effort. Anna lit fires in the kitchen and in the bedroom, and when Willie returned with Dr. McPherson, water was boiling and tea made. "You'd better get a woman in," said the doctor curtly, in the kitchen, when he had finished his examination of Sarah. "Some neighbor for tonight, and I'll send a nurse up from the cottage hospital early tomorrow morning. Not that it will be the least use. She must have been dying for the last 2 days at least. She's got pericarditis and pleurisy. She's breathing, I don't know how many to the minute, and her temperature is just about as high as it can be. It all follows from rheumatism, and then taking cold. Gross carelessness and neglect all through. I've no patience with such work." He turned angrily to Willie. I don't know what on earth you were thinking of, Mr. Price, not to send for me earlier." Willie, abashed and guilty, found nothing to say. His eye had the meek wistfulness of Holman Hunt's scapegoat. "Mr. Price wanted her to have the doctor," said Anna, defending him with warmth, "but she wouldn't. He is out at the works all day till late at night. How was he to know how she was? She could walk about." The tall doctor glanced at Anna in surprise, and at once modified his tone. "Yes," he said, "that's the curious thing. It passes me how she managed to get about, but there is no knowing what an obstinate woman won't force herself to do. I'll send the medicine up tonight, and come along myself with the nurse early tomorrow. Meantime, keep careful to my instructions." That night remains forever fixed in Anna's memory, the grim rooms echoing and shadowy, the countless journeys up and down dark stairs and passages, Willie sitting always immovable in the kitchen, idle because there was nothing for him to do, Sarah incessantly panting on the truckle bed, the hired woman from up the street, buxom, kindly, useful, but fatuous in the endless monotony of her commiserations. Toward morning, Sarah Vawdrey gave sign of a desire to talk. "I fought the fight," she murmured to Anna, who alone was in the bedroom with her. "I fought the fight. I've kept the faith. In that box there you'll see a purse. There's 17 pounds 6 in it. That will pay for the funeral, and Willie must have what's over. There would have been more for the lad, but he never paid me no wages this 2 years past. I never troubled him." "Don't tell Willie that," Anna said impetuously. Bless you, no," said the dying drudge, and then seemed to doze. Anna went to the kitchen and sent the woman upstairs. "How is she?" asked Willie without stirring. Anna shook her head. "Neither her nor me will be here much longer, I'm thinking," he said, smiling wearily. "What?" she exclaimed, startled. "Mr. Sutton has arranged to sell our business as a going concern. Some people at Turnhill are buying it. I shall go to Australia. There's no room for me here. The creditors have promised to allow me 25 pounds, and I can get an assisted passage. Bursley'll know me no more. But I shall always remember you and what you've done." She longed to kneel at his feet, and to comfort him, and to cry, "It is I who have ruined you, driven your father to cheating his servant, to crime, to suicide, driven you to forgery, and turned you out of your house, which your old servant killed herself in making clean for me. I have wronged you, and I love you like a mother because I have wronged you, and because I saved you from prison." But she said nothing except, "Some of us will miss you." The next day Sarah Vawdrey died. She who had never lived save in the fetters of slavery and fanaticism. After 50 years of ceaseless labor, she had gained the affection of one person, and enough money to pay for her own funeral. Willie Price took a cheap lodging with the woman who had been called in on the night of Sarah's collapse. Before Christmas he was to sail to Melbourne. The Priory, deserted, gave up its rickety furniture to a van from Hanbridge, where, in an auction room, the frail sticks lost their identity in a medley of other sticks, and ceased to be. Then the bricklayer, the plasterer, the painter, and the paper hanger came to the Priory, and whistled and sang in it. End of chapter 12. Recording by Monique Michener, Randallstown, Maryland. Chapter 13 of Anna of the 5 Towns. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Monique Michener. Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 13, The Bazaar. The Wesleyan Bazaar, the greatest undertaking of its kind ever known in Bursley, gradually became a cloud which filled the entire social horizon. Mrs. Sutton, organizer of the Sunday school stall, pressed all her friends into the service, and a fortnight after the death of Sarah Vaudrey, Anna and even Agnes gave much of their spare time to the work, which was carried on under pressure increasing daily as the final moments approached. This was well for Anna, in that it diverted her thoughts by keeping her energies fully engaged. One morning, however, it occurred to Mrs. Sutton to reflect that Anna at such a period of life should be otherwise employed. Anna had called at the Suttons to deliver some finished garments. "My dear," she said, "I am very much obliged to you for all this industry, but I've been thinking that as you are to be married in February, you ought to be preparing your things." "My things," Anna repeated idly, and then she remembered Miners's phrase on the hill, "Can you be ready by that time?" "Yes," said Mrs. Sutton, "but possibly you've been getting forward with them on the quiet." "Tell me," said Anna, with an air of interest. "I've meant to ask you before. Is it the bride's place to provide all the house linen and that sort of thing? It was in my day, but those things alter so. The bride took all the house linen to her husband, and as many clothes for herself as would last a year. That was the rule. We used to stitch everything at home in those days. Everything. And we had what we called a bottom drawer to store them in. As soon as a girl passed her 15th birthday, she began to sew for the bottom drawer. But all those things changed so. I dare say it's different now." "How much will it cost to buy everything, do you think?" Anna asked. Just then Beatrice entered the room. "Beatrice, Anna is inquiring how much it will cost to buy her trousseau and the house linen. What do you say?" "Oh," Beatrice replied without any hesitation, "a couple of hundred at least." Mrs. Sutton, reading Anna's face, smiled reassuringly. "Nonsense, Bee. I dare say you could do it on 100 with care, Anna." "Why should Anna want to do it with care?" Beatrice asked curtly. Anna went straight across the road to her father and asked him for 100 pounds of her own money. She had not spoken to him, save under necessity, since the evening spent at the Suttons. "What's afoot now?" he questioned savagely. "I must buy things for the wedding clothes and things, father." "Aye, clothes, clothes. What clothes dost want? A few pounds will cover them. There'll be all the linen for the house. Linen for— It's none thy place for buy that." "Yes, father, it is." "I say it isna." "But I've asked Mrs. Sutton, and she says it is." "What business an ye for go blabbing thy affairs all over Bosley?" "I say isna thy place for buy linen, and that be sufficient. Go and get dinner. It's nigh on 12 now." That evening, when Agnes had gone to bed, she resumed the struggle. "Father, I must have that 100 pounds. I really must. I mean it." "Thou means it, what?" "I mean I must have 100 pounds. I'd advise thee to take care of thy tongue, my lass. Thou means it." "But you needn't give it me all at once," she pursued. He gazed at her glowering. "I shanna give it thee. It's Henry's place for buy thy house linen." "Father, it isn't." Her voice broke, but only for an instant. "I'm asking you for my own money. You seem to want to make me miserable just before my wedding. I wish to God thou'dst never seen Henry Minors. It's given thee pride and made thee undutiful. I'm only asking you for my own money." Her calm insistence maddened him. Jumping up from his chair, he stamped out of the room, and she heard him strike a match in his office. Presently he returned, and threw angrily onto the table in front of her a check-book and pass-book, the deposit book she had always kept herself for convenience of paying into the bank. "Here," he said scornfully, "take thy trats and ne'er speak to me again. I wash my hands of ye. Take 'em, and do what ye na mind. Chuck thy money into the cut for aught I care." The next evening Henry came up. She observed that his face had a grave look, but intent on her own difficulties, she did not remark on it, and proceeded at once to do what she resolved to do. It was a cold night in November, yet the miser, wrathfully sullen, chose to sit in his office without a fire. Agnes was working sums in the kitchen. "Henry," Anna began, "I've had a difficulty with father, and I must tell you." "Not about the wedding, I hope," he said. "It was about money. Of course, Henry, I can't get married without a lot of money." "Why not?" he inquired. "I've my own things to get," she said, "and I've all the house linen to buy." "Oh, you buy the house linen, do you?" She saw that he was relieved by that information. "Of course. Well, I told father I must have £100, and he wouldn't give it to me. And when I stuck to him, he got angry. You know he can't bear to see money spent. And at last he got a little savage and gave me my bank books, and said he'd have nothing more to do with my money." Henry's face broke into a laugh, and Anna was obliged to smile. "Capital," he said. "Couldn't be better." "I want you to tell me how much I've got in the bank," she said. "I only know I'm always paying in odd checks." He examined the 3 books. "A very tidy bit," he said, "something over £250. So you can draw checks at your ease." "Draw me a check for £20, she said, and then, while he wrote, "Henry, after we're married, I shall want you to take charge of all this." "Yes, of course I will do that, dear, but your money will be yours. There ought to be a settlement on you. Still, if your father says nothing, it is not for me to say anything." "Father will say nothing now," she said. "You've never shown any interest in it, Henry. But as we're talking of money, I may as well tell you that father says I'm worth £50,000. The man of business was astonished and enraptured beyond measure. His countenance shone with delight. "Surely not," he protested formally. "That's what father told me, and he made me read a list of shares and so on." "We will go slow to begin with," said Minors solemnly. He had not expected more than £15,000 or £20,000, and even this sum had dazzled his imagination. He was glad that he had only taken the house at Toft End on a yearly tenancy. He now saw himself the dominant figure in all of the 5 towns. Later in the evening he disclosed, perfunctorily, the matter which had been a serious weight on his mind when he entered the house, but which this revelation of vast wealth had diminished to a trifle. Titus Price had been the treasurer of the building fund which the bazaar was designed to assist. Minors had assumed the position of the dead man, and that day, in going through the accounts, he had discovered that a sum of £50 was missing. "It's a dreadful thing for Willie if it gets about," he said. "A tale of that sort would follow him to Australia." "Oh, Henry, it is," she exclaimed, sorrow-stricken. "But we mustn't let it get about. Let us pay the money ourselves. You must enter it in the books and say nothing." "That is impossible," he said firmly. "I can't alter the accounts. At least I can't alter the bank book and the vouchers. The auditor would detect it in a minute. Besides, I should not be doing my duty if I kept a thing like this from the superintendent minister. He, at any rate, must know, and perhaps the stewards. But you can urge them to say nothing. Tell them that you will make it good. I will write a check at once." "I had meant to find the 50 myself," he said. It was a bedlam sum to him now. "Let me pay half, then," she asked. "If you like," he urged, smiling faintly at her eagerness. "The thing is bound to be kept quiet. It would create such a frightful scandal. Poor old chap," he added carelessly. "I suppose he was hard run, and meant to put it back, as they all do mean." But it was useless for minors to affect depression of spirits, or mournful sympathy with the errors of a dead sinner. The 50,000 danced a jig in his brain that night. Anna was absorbed in contemplating the misfortune of Willie Price. She prayed wildly that he might never learn the full depth of his father's fall. The miserable robbery of Sarah's wages was buried for evermore, and this new delinquency, which all would regard as flagrant sacrilege, must be buried also. A soul less loyal than Anna's might have feared that Willie, a self-convicted forger, had been a party to the embezzlement, but Anna knew that it could not be so. It was characteristic of Miners's cautious prudence that, the first intoxication having passed, he made no further reference of any kind to Anna's fortune. The arrangements for their married life were planned on a scale which ignored the 50,000 pounds. For both their sakes, he wished to avoid all friction with the miser, at any rate, until his status as Anna's husband would enable him to enforce her rights, if that should be necessary, with dignity and effectiveness. He did not precisely anticipate trouble, but the fact had not escaped him that Ephraim still held the whole of Anna's securities. He was in no hurry to enlarge his borders. He knew that there were 24 hours in every day, 365 days in every year, and 30 good years in life still left to him, and therefore that there would be ample time after the wedding for the execution of his purposes in regard to that 50,000 pounds. Meanwhile, he told Anna that he had set aside 200 pounds for the purchase of furniture for the Priory, a modest sum, but he judged it sufficient. His method was to buy a piece at a time, always second-hand, but always good. The bargain hunt was up, and Anna soon yielded to its mild satisfactions. In the matter of her trousseau and the house linen, Anna, having obtained the needed money at so dear a cost, found yet another obstacle in the imminent bazaar, which occupied Mrs. Sutton and Beatrice so completely that they could not contrive any opportunity to assist her in shopping. It was decided between them that every article should be bought ready-made and seamed, and that the first week of the new year, if indeed Mrs. Sutton survived the bazaar, should be entirely and absolutely devoted to Anna's business. At nights, when she had leisure to think, Anna was astonished how during the day she had forgotten her preoccupations in the activities precedent to the bazaar, or in choosing furniture with miners. But she never slept without thinking of Willie Price, and hoping that no further disaster might overtake him. The incident of the embezzled 50 pounds had been closed, and she had given a check for 25 pounds to miners. He had acquainted the minister with the facts, and Mr. Banks had decided that the 2 circuit stewards must be informed. Beyond these the scandalous secret was not to go. But Anna wondered whether a secret shared by 5 persons could long remain a secret. The bazaar was a triumphant and unparalleled success, and of the 7 stalls, the Sunday school stall stood first each night in the nightly returns. The scene in the town hall, on the 4th and final night, a Saturday, was as delirious and gay as a carnival. 420 pounds had been raised up to tea time, and it was the impassioned desire of everyone to achieve 500. The price of admission had been reduced to 3d, in order that the artisan might enter and spend his wages in an excellent cause. The 7 stalls, ranged round the room like so many bowers of beauty, draped and frilled and floriated, and still laden with countless articles of use and ornament, were continually reinforced with purchasers by emissaries canvassing the crowd which filled the middle of the paper-strewn floor. The horse was not only taken to the water, but compelled to drink, and many a man who, outside, would have laughed at the risk of being robbed, was robbed openly, shamelessly, under the gaze of ministers and class leaders. Bouquets were sold at $1 each, and at the refreshment stall a glass of milk cost 6d. The noise rivaled that of a fair. There was no quiet anywhere, save in the farthest recess of each stall, where the lady in supreme charge of it, like a spider in the middle of its web, watched customers and cash-box with equal cupidity. Mrs. Sutton, at 7 o'clock, had not returned from tea, and Anna and Beatrice, who managed the Sunday school stall in her absence, feared that she had at last succumbed under the strain, but shortly afterwards she hurried back breathless to her place. "See that, Anna? It will be reckoned in our returns," she said, exhibiting a piece of paper. It was Ephraim's check for 25 pounds, promised months ago, but on a condition which has not been fulfilled. She has the secret of persuading him, thought Anna. Why have I never found it? Then Agnes, in a new white frock, came up with 3 shillings, proceeds of bouquets. "But you must take that to the flower stall, my pet," said Mrs. Sutton. "Can't I give it to you?" the child pleaded. "I want your stall to be the best." Miners arrived next, with something concealed in tissue paper. He removed the paper and showed, in a frame of crimson plush, a common white plate decorated with a simple band and line, and a monogram in the center, A.T. Anna blushed, recognizing the plate which she had painted that afternoon in July at Miners's Works. "Can you sell this?" Miners asked Mrs. Sutton. "I'll try to," said Mrs. Sutton doubtfully, not in the secret. "What's it meant for?" "Try to sell it to me," said Miners. "Well," she laughed, "what will you give?" "A couple of sovereigns." "Make it guineas." He paid the money and requested Anna to keep the plate for him. At 9 o'clock it was announced that, though raffling was forbidden, the bazaar would be enlivened by an auction. A licensed auctioneer was brought, and the sale commenced. The auctioneer, however, failed to attune himself to the wild spirit of the hour, and his professional efforts would have resulted in a fiasco had not Miners, perceiving the danger, leaped to the platform and masterfully assumed the hammer. Miners surpassed himself in the kind of wit that amuses an excited crowd, and the auction soon monopolized the attention of the room. It was always afterwards remembered as the crowning success of the bazaar. The incredible man took 10 pounds in 20 minutes. During this episode, Anna, who had been left alone in the stall, first noticed Willie Price in the room. His ship sailed on the Monday, but steerage passengers had to be aboard on Sunday, and he was saying goodbye to a few acquaintances. He seemed quite cheerful as he walked about with his hands in his pockets, chatting with this one and that. It was the false and hysterical gaiety that precedes a final separation. As soon as he saw Anna, he came towards her. "Well, good-bye, Miss Tellwright," he said jauntily. "I leave for Liverpool tomorrow morning. Wish me luck." Nothing more, no word, no accent, to recall the terrible but sublime past. "I do," she answered. They shook hands, others approaching. He drifted away. Her glance followed him like a beneficent influence. For 3 days she had carried in her pocket an envelope containing a banknote for £100, intending by some device to force it on him as a parting gift. Now the last chance was lost, and she had not even attempted this difficult feat of charity. Such futility, she reflected, self-scorning, was of a piece with her life. "He hasn't really gone. He hasn't really gone," she kept repeating, and yet knew well that he had gone. "Do you know what they are saying, Anna?" said Beatrice, when after 11 o'clock the bazaar was closed to the public, and the stall holders and their assistants were preparing to depart, their movements hastened by the stern aspect of the town hall keeper. "No, what?" said Anna, and in the same moment guessed. "They say old Titus Price embezzled £50 from the building fund, and Henry made it up privately, so that there shouldn't be a scandal. Just fancy. Do you believe it?" The secret was abroad. She looked round the room and saw it in every face. "Who says?" Anna demanded fiercely. "It's all over the place. Miss Dickinson told me." "You will be glad to know, ladies," Miner's voice sang out from the platform, "that the total proceeds, so far as we can calculate them now, exceed £525. There was clapping of hands, which died out suddenly. "Now, Agnes," Anna called, "come along, quick. You're as white as a sheet. Good night, Mrs. Sutton. Good night, Bee." Miners was still occupied on the platform. The town hall keeper extinguished some of the lights. The bazaar was over. End of chapter 13. Recording by Monique Mitchener, Randallstown, Maryland. Chapter 14 of Anna of the Five Towns. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Monique Mitchener. Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 14. End of A Simple Soul. The next morning at 7:30, Anna was standing in the garden doorway of the Priory. The sun had just risen, the air was cold, roof and pavement were damp, rain had fallen, and more was to fall. A door opened higher up the street, and Willie Price came out, carrying a small bag. He turned to speak to some person within the house, and then stepped forward. As he passed Anna, she sprang forth. "Oh," she cried, "I had just come up here to see if the workmen had locked up properly. We have some of our new furniture in the house, you know." She was as red as the sun over Hillport. He glanced at her. "Have you heard?" he asked simply. "About what?" she whispered. "About my poor old father." "Yes, I was hoping you would never know." By a common impulse, they went into the garden of the Priory, and he shut the door. "Never know?" he repeated. "Oh, they took care to tell me." A silence followed. "Is that your luggage?" she inquired. He lifted up the handbag and nodded. "All of it?" "Yes," he said. "I'm only an immigrant." "I've got a note here for you," she said. "I should have posted it to the steamer, but now you can take it yourself. I want you not to read it till you get to Melbourne." "Very well," he said, and crumpled the proffered envelope into his pocket. He was not thinking of the note at all. Presently he asked, "Why didn't you tell me about my father? If I had to hear it, I'd sooner have heard it from you." "You must try to forget it," she urged him. "You are not your father." "I wish I had never been born," he said. "I wish I'd gone to prison." Now was the moment when, if ever, the mother's influence should be exerted. "Be a man," she said softly. "I did the best I could for you. I shall always think of you in Australia getting on." She put a hand on his shoulder. "Yes," she said again passionately, "I shall always remember you, always." The hand with which he touched her arm shook like an old man's hand. As their eyes met in an intense and painful gaze, to her at least, it was revealed that they were lovers. What he had learnt in that instant can only be guessed from his next action. Anna ran out of the garden into the street and so home, never looking behind to see if he pursued his way to the station. Some may argue that Anna, knowing she loved another man, ought not to have married minors, but she did not reason thus. Such a notion never even occurred to her. She had promised to marry minors, and she married him. Nothing else was possible. She who had never failed in duty did not fail then. She who had always submitted and bowed the head, submitted and bowed the head then. She had sucked in with her mother's milk the profound truth that a woman's life is always a renunciation, greater or less. Hers by chance was greater. Facing the future calmly and genially, she took oath with herself to be a good wife to the man whom, with all excellences, she had never loved. Her thoughts often dwelt lovingly on Willie Price, whom she deemed to be pursuing in Australia an honorable and successful career, quickened at the outset by her £100. This vision of him was her stay. But neither she nor anyone in the Five Towns or elsewhere ever heard of Willie Price again, and well might none hear. The abandoned pit shaft does not deliver up its secret, and so the Bank of England is the richer by £100 unclaimed, and the world the poorer by a simple and meek soul stung to revolt only in its last hour. End of chapter 14. Recording by Monique Michener, Randallstown, Maryland. End of Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett.